Welcome.
Hey, how are you?
Been meaning to do this for a long time. I appreciate you coming.
Oh, happy to do that. Don't get out here very often, and especially since the fire. It's nice to be in LA and see people are moving around and life's going on.
Louisiana to Los Angeles.
Yeah, to the two LAs, right?
Tell me what it's like, because I imagine you at home on the bayou, sitting on your porch.
Yeah, we do literally live on the bayou. Yeah, I have a lake behind me, and it goes into the bayou and into a swamp, basically. So I live on 6 acres right in the middle of town. Luckily, my neighbor has 100 acres, so it's like I have 106. He's never home. He's a billionaire that has houses everywhere, so he has a horse farm there. And if you look at an aerial view, it's like houses are everywhere, but I don't see any when I'm there, so it's nice.
You got a little place to yourself. Any gators in the swamp?
Gators come over. They come out of the swamp and they get into my lake, and when they do, they get shot.
You've been there how long now?
I've been in that house 17 years. I bought it. I was in the country club, which was down the way, and I had this big house in the country club that I built, and actually. It was a big disturbance over the years because I had it, and when I sold it, I sold it to a rapper named Master P, who was out in California for a while, and that was kind of odd. Actually, he had been from New Orleans, and there was this big, but this big mystery of who was going to buy my house because he was kind of said he was a entertainer from L.A., and I went, Laura, Arkansas? I didn't know, and said, you're telling me somebody from L.A. is coming to Baton Rouge, Louisiana to buy a house? And they said, yeah. And it ended up, this guy had grown up in New Orleans, and he didn't want to be in the city, so he wanted to be outside the city. We were about 35, 40 minutes away. So it worked out, but it ended up being on Time magazine, and with an aerial picture of my house, and people calling me from 2020, some news magazine that was on TV with Barbara Walters at the time. And, it was kind of, I got him Stone. I forgot what his first name was. But it was a big deal. So, I moved out of there and moved into this house, and happy because I was born on a farm in the middle of the last century. So I like being out in country. I like being nature, trees.
And you were born, was that in Louisiana? Your whole life you've been out there?
Yeah, I was born in North Louisiana, a small town called Pleasant Hill, believe it or not. An idyllic name, kind of. My mother, father, my older brother, who I practiced with for almost 50 years, was there, and myself. And I have 2 younger brothers that were born later that my mother had when she was like in her mid-40s. 3 ophthalmologists out of the 4 boys, and one's a PA in ophthalmology.
I sat down a couple months ago and I was reviewing your family history. You have one of those dynasties within optometry and ophthalmology. And I was so confused because there's so many Williams and Chucks and Bills, and I had to almost draw out the family tree, the lineage of the Williamsons, to try and understand kind of what's been going on.
Yeah, my dad was an optometrist, and he went to World War II. He actually fought in World War II, came back, got married, and he went to Northern Illinois College of Optometry because there weren't a lot of optometry schools around in Chicago. And my older brother had just been born, so he's about 4.5 years old. So he was actually in school at that time, and then they came back to this little small town to practice. And he didn't stay long in town because he had a lot of old buddies and fishing buddies, and he had too many times that he had posted on his door, gone fishing, So mother got him out of that and moved to Shreveport, and then down to Baton Rouge eventually when I was younger. But my early years was out on the farm where my mother's mother was. Had both grandparents in town. My dad's mother was a mathematician, and he had 2 brothers that were engineers. But I preferred to be out on the farm with all the rednecks and the farmers and the oil field workers and stuff like that, because there was a lot of fun out there. So that's my older brother and I were like that. And only way to get out of get off the farm is either athletics or basically academics. So luckily I got out on a football scholarship and was an academic All-American when I went to LSU. But my degree was in creative writing and art, which is a little bit different, My older brother's degree was in European history. So our parents believed you went to college to be educated, you went to professional school to be trained. There's quite a big bit of difference between the two.
Yeah, I appreciate you giving me a background because my first foray into Chuck Williamson took place through the RSA probably 6-7 years ago when I was a resident. And, it's a great community, and there's other communities now, and we'll get into that later. But just the discourse and the discussion taking place, and this guy named Chuck Williamson was always chiming in with a beautifully written essay, pre-ChatGPT, so I know it was from the heart from you. And there's just so much knowledge and wisdom and finding out your background about the creative writing, and you have lived many different lives before ophthalmology, but growing up on the farm, I know you have this influence with engineering, mathematics, optometry in the background, but what made you want to finally do that switch to do something different than creative writing into the more math and sciences?
Well, in those days, people got married younger. I was married, I had a year of eligibility left, actually, and was a starting tight end and made the academic All-American team. They still keep me in the program there, and a pitcher there. And we'd won a championship and that sort of thing, but the professional leagues were looking at me as a tight end. That I was a quarterback in high school. Turns out when I got there, there were like 15 quarterbacks, and I said, "Oh, well, what are all these guys?" I thought, said, "Well, no, you're not going to play quarterback." So it's kind of like in baseball, they get shortstops, a whole bunch of shortstops that are athletes, and they make them different things. And same thing in football. Our coach's idea was a quarterback was usually the best athlete on the team. And, these guys were made into running backs, defensive backs, and, ends and various things like that. But I knew I published some things in Southern Literary Review and some poetry, and I was painting. And it was pretty obvious to me my brother was already finished with medical school, 4.5 years older, and already had a residency lined up in ophthalmology, influence from my dad who was in optometry. So basically, I took all the courses enough to basically get in. I got the President's Award for the highest academic average that year in 1972 when I graduated. So the idea was, I said, well, as long as I can make A's, that's fine. And and we were good at academics. And they said, well, you could play professional ball. I said, I have to work really hard to be a football player. I'm a pretty good football player, but a much better student. So that worked out for me. Years later, we have reunions, and half those guys are dead, and the other half are brain dead. So it's kind of like, I'm pretty lucky that I kind of escaped that extra beating, you had in the pros.
Yeah. It's kind of sad, the timeline or lifeline, let's say, after playing professional football.
Yeah.
But so you finish undergrad, you get this creative writing degree. You understand probably you're going to do something in medical school. Was it always obvious you're going to follow the footsteps of your dad and older brother and go into the ophthalmology? It wasn't really a family business yet at that time,
Yeah, it wasn't yet. In fact, I was totally against it. My older brother was going to go into ophthalmology, but, I decided when I got there, absolutely, that I'm not going to do that, right? So, you're excited about it, and you're, working in the emergency room. And those days, medicine was completely different than it was when Blake, my son, went to medical school. You learned everything. You were very involved, and you were in the charity hospital systems, which mean you did a lot. I delivered 55 babies as a junior in medical school, and you're working in the ERs down there, and you're doing everything yourself. It's kind of like you're very, very hands-on. But after 4 years of it, and you start to realize the difference between what you thought it was romantically and what it actually is. I remember, balancing the electrolytes of, 3 people on ventilators so that they would die at electrolyte balance, and I was like, God, this would be an awful job to have forever. So, I kind of fell to my knees and said, thank God you can get for ophthalmology, because, it's my sort of my personality was what we all like, which is being able to fix things, and we all see people in the different types of professions, and it's just kind of like this long decline of people, and they're just kind of presiding over it over the years. And for us, you know, we go in, we fix the problem, we see the patient out at a restaurant, they say thank you, and you know, it's a lot better gratification than you know, kind of inside work and no heavy lifting, you know.
Right. What was the state of ophthalmology at the time when you were going into residency? There's some things in our field that have not changed at all. For example, slit lamps, they're still pretty much what they were back then. But the understanding we had of the eye and disease states and the level of technology was very different. What was that like as a resident?
Well, the intraocular lens changed everything. Implant lenses changed everything. It was the best thing that happened because what happened is, as you would guess, much like Europe, where's this sort of professorial domination, you know, where there's this basically tenure, as you would see, like for politicians, these guys are in forever. So you'd see the young guys kind of waiting their time, because reality was that you were doing intracapsular cataract extractions, taking a lens out and putting people in aphakic spectacles. So, you know, they were sort of, well, you know, you have to wait your time and you have to wait. And then all of a sudden there was this technology explosion, meaning that intraocular lenses came in and were approved in the early 70s, you know, and basically then the phaco came in about the same time. So phacoemulsification came in. And all of these older, and then lasers, of course, came in, and all of that. You know, the older guys weren't equipped to do that. Plus, general ophthalmology has never been, ever, even today, a progressive, welcoming group for new technology. Everything that happened, there was always a pushback. There was always a pushback. You know, Harold Ridley did the first lens in 1947, and he was scorned and basically, based by general ophthalmology, but particularly Duke Elder, who was kind of the elder statesman in Europe and that sort of thing for 20 years until, you know, he became the hero. But that was 20 years later that he had to, you know, get that reward. So that was the way it was. And then the younger guys, you know, we adopted to that. Obviously, that's all we knew, and we improved very fast, very quickly. We kind of took to that technology, pars plana vitrectomies, everything. I was basically comprehensively trained, probably the last of that line. So I'm 74 years old, but I did all our retina for our group for 5 or 6 years. So my first procedure was pars plana vitrectomy, giant retinal tear. And, you know, I did all the corneas, my own corneas for 30 years. I did DCRs, exenerations, muscles. There was not a procedure known in ophthalmology that I didn't do. So, and we did all of those because, you know, as a young guy, it's like, okay, I'm doing two cataracts, and then I'm going to do 2 lids, and I'm going to do this. And it was sort of like that. And then I wasn't in practice very long. I came from the Eye Foundation Hospital, which is a 105-bed eye hospital. So the progression there was that suddenly in 1984, when I got out at 79, 80, 1984, people were talking about moving, basically Medicare was talking about moving outpatient cataract surgery out of the hospital department and moving it into freestanding surgery centers. So I started building a surgery center 2 or 3 years before that happened. By the time we built, it happened in 84. It happened to be the maybe second or third Medicare certified surgery center in the United States, just simply because of the timing. It wasn't certified until 84.
But what led to that? What made you think, this sounds like a good idea. Let's move surgery from the hospital to an ambulatory setting?
Well, they'd been talking about it for years, and coming from an eye hospital that was just a pure eye hospital in Birmingham, which was great. We had multiple hospitals around it all over. There's a great hospital complex there, the University Hospital, Diabetic Hospital at the time, Children's Hospital, VA Hospital across the street. And we did all the work there. We had 7 residents. I ended up being the chief resident there. And they were a very progressive group. They had one of the early phacos, things like that. The Callahans had built this beautiful building. And so when I got out, of course, I went immediately, I had to do surgery at the hospital. And, we were kind of the young guys, and we were kind of told to, keep shut up, keep our place. We weren't given block time, meaning that we would have to do a cataract and then go back into the doctor's room and sit down and talk to all these old doctors and shoot the bull while somebody did a gallbladder and somebody else did something else, and then you do another case, and it'd take all day. And they weren't progressive because I said, yeah, we need to do pars plana vitrectomies. We need to do this. And they said, well, nobody has them, and Dr. So-and-so's been here 30 years, and you're just starting, so wait your turn. So we kind of were not willing to wait.
Why? Why though? Because the status quo had been it. That's just how things are done.
Yeah.
Sit in the surgeon room, wait your turn. What was it within you that said, no, I want to do this differently?
That was basically with us. We weren't the kind of people that were basically going to sit down and basically, have to wait and do this. We weren't that. My older brother and myself, when I went into practice, and we had a partner then, we decided we were going to do that. And I think some of it was the impetus when I came in was basically where I came from was a little more progressive. And it was like, no, we're going to do this. We're going to build it. In fact, I was building it before the rules were there. And so it happened to come available at the time. It was a perfect timing for us. And, I was called into the office of the director of the hospital. He looked at us and he looked at me and he said, you're a dangerous person. He said, what if doctors start doing their own surgery centers? What if they start thinking for themselves? And he said, that's dangerous. You're competing with us, and we're a multi-billion-dollar. It was a Catholic hospital, so they had multiple hospitals. And he said, so we need to do something. We need to get rid of you. We need to stop you. And I said, well, you've just basically threatened me and my family, so game on. So at that time, medical advertising was, it was kind of something a lot of people didn't do, right? Late 70s, early 80s. So I went to an advertising agency and said, I don't know anything about advertising. What do you got to do? And they told me. And I said, okay, we had billboards, we had newsletters, we had radio, we had TV. We blew them away. And they got about all the other doctors that were in the hospital got together and tried to do a little advertising cartel, and I think they did it. I mean, within 2 weeks, they just fell apart, basically. So that was kind of, it was kind of, necessity is the mother of invention. So it's kind of like, yeah, that's what got us going. And we just kept on. We never stopped. We always realized that you want to be, if you're not on the edge, you're taking up too much room. You got to stay on the edge, and that's what you do. And you keep sharp, and that's what we learned, and that's what we still do today. It's kind of our idea. It's like if you can get it, whatever the best is, you can get that. And that worked out for us. That philosophy worked out for us. And being young, we had nothing to lose.
Yeah. So in our field, unfortunately, anytime anything new is introduced, Bob Osher, a good friend and mentor of mine, he says it always takes like 15, 20 years before the masses accept it and that becomes the new standard.
Right.
So you saw the introduction of IOL technology, you saw the introduction of phacoemulsification technology, and then you sort of ushered in this era of ASCs. What was the reception like amongst your colleagues and then maybe patients in the community to all of these new changes taking place?
Well, the patients loved it. Basically, what we didn't know at the time, which is different nowadays, probably if a new surgery center pops up, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to rush to it. But in those days, rather than go to the hospital, and, they were paying us 55% of the outpatient fee. Obviously, that was kind of standardized. But it was not under the CMS. It was not under, or HCFA at the time. Pre-CMS was called HCFA, Healthcare Financing Authority, basically. So their idea, it was based on what the hospital did. The charges for the hospital, we got 55%, but we made up for it in efficiency. And that's nothing but increased over the time. Whereas we were getting about $2,000 per procedure for a routine cataract, which in nowadays terms are $1983, $1984 is $6,000. So it'd be like a regular cataract that you would get $6,000 for, and today, and the lenses were invoice price. So just standard PMA lenses that cost very little to make were $490, $500, and they were paying invoice price. Plus, we actually could have our own assistants, meaning our fellows, because back in those days, Medicare paid an extra 20 to 25% if you had an assistant surgeon. That was popularized in the Northeast because they didn't do a lot of surgery over there. There was so much competition that people kind of operated together, and it was an extra 20% bump. But we did so many cases, it took off that we could pay for all of our fellows very easy.
And so we're just kind of taking for granted that you did all of this, but I want to take it back to young Chuck. Yeah. You're like, okay, I'm going to open my own surgery center. I don't like the way things are being done here. How did you go about doing that at the time? How did you get the capital? How did you vet the space, the land, meeting with architects? There's so much that goes into building an ASC. Take me back to that.
Yeah, we got an architect basically out of Minnesota that had some experience in building outpatient surgery centers. Obviously, we didn't know much about it, and in those days, the freestanding outpatient surgery centers, there's some in town, and we actually owned part of one, and we could go over there and do muscle procedures under private insurance, but we couldn't do Medicare cases basically. So we understood that, and at that time there was the regulations where you almost had to build those that looked like a hospital. So it was tile all up the walls and that sort of thing. So it was fairly expensive, but also the financials were a lot easier back in those days. Meaning that guys came out to your house and you were a doctor and you had a 2-page document that you would sign and say, well, how much do I need? How much money do you need, doctor? And, it wasn't like all these pages you sign in initial nowadays. So banks were willing to give you the money, and just on the idea that you're a doctor, you're going to have to end up paying it back. And we weren't thinking about, it wasn't the high idea that we see around with a lot of people who are successful, and they think about bigger houses and bigger vacations and bigger cars. Our idea was we were building the building and building our careers first, and that's where we kind of invested our money in doing that. We were actually, strangely enough, the guy who was the senator from Louisiana was the head of the House Ways Committee in the Senate at the time. He brought us in. We actually had him do the dedication when we did our surgery center. He brought us in the office and he set us all down, young guys, and he said, okay, you guys have, you've done a big thing. It's a lot of money here that you're invested. You've got a big risk. And he said, but you need to pay attention. And we said, well, what, pay attention to what? He said, the government's going to get you. So the government's after you. And we said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, healthcare at that time was about 12% of the gross domestic product. Now it's almost 19%, 19%. And he said, look, you guys leave, new doctors leave big footprints. So they got to find a way to decrease costs. So eventually they're going to decrease, they're going to find a way. And, we're thinking, he's this old guy. He was older at the time. We thought, he's just a little crazy and, this is a political thing. But sure enough, that $2,000 basically came down to $500. So the CMS, that group, basically found ways to decrease as you got better, as results got better, as you were doing more. They found creative ways to decrease our primary procedure by 95%. Now, just think about if you're a car dealer or you do anything else. What if the cars were worth, they reduced it by 95%? They couldn't stay alive. So basically, that was what they did. That's the CMS. That's the idea of the CMS. The same CMS, by the way, for people with outpatient, basically doing outpatient or basically doing office surgery, office-based surgery. It's the same CMS that floated the letter in 2014 that cherry-picked the one procedure of cataract and said, why don't you do this in the office? Now, they weren't in charge of the facility fee, which had gone up, obviously over the years. But they were in charge basically of the physician's fee, which had gone down So it said, you could do this in the office. What about that? And of course, they sent that to AIO and ACRS and everybody, and we're like, well, that's a bad idea. Like, how are we going to reproduce the same safety situations or the same thing in the office as outpatient? And they already had that in hand because they had been working with Kaiser Permanente, who had been doing it for years. So there's no question that it could be done outpatient and done in the office. That was not the question. They already knew that. That was kind of the prop that they were putting out there, that, well, we're going to say at some point we're going to prove its safety. The reality of what they said in that same letter is we want to reduce the cost of surgery. So what they did was they reduced the cost by taking out of the hospital and the ASCs. Then they want to reduce the cost by taking out of the ASCs and put it into the office. But when they do, I don't think they haven't given a facility fee yet. They're totally in charge of the fee you get. So, it's kind of like the fox in charge of the hen house. And we were like, eventually this is going to be a really bad idea. If you can get enough cases into outpatient centers, the reality that is there is they could declare that procedure an office-based procedure. And you say, well, what? You're operating a surgery center. I said, well, what effect will that have? Well, then the surgery center could still do the cases, but they'd have to do it at the lower price, which they probably couldn't do it at that price. And we wouldn't imagine that we would say, oh, no, but obviously there's less regulations. There's easier because it's easier. Obviously, you don't have to do the same thing you do at the surgery center. You don't have to do the same paperwork. But they're fully capable then of doing what they've just done over the past 40 years or 50 years. It's increase the regulations then. So that what they're looking for is to control doctors. They want, cataract surgery is the most frequent Medicare, basically procedure, which is, outpatient and elective. And it costs a lot of money. People are getting older, so that's a big expense. So the idea is that how can we reduce that expense? They need to control the doctors. They need to make the doctors docile employees. Presently, 77% of physicians are either employees of a hospital or a healthcare center, 77%. And they did a survey of residents, 66% of residents getting out want to work for a hospital. So the danger we're looking at in all of medicine is becoming employees, much like they do with healthcare overseas. And you see these doctors don't do as many cases. A lot of them are on boards or basically doing lectures. They're kind of making money in other ways, have smaller basically practices. And, it's a different mentality, but, you're going to have to fight that because it's going to affect you sooner. Just like the old guy, I'm the old guy telling you the warning like the old guy told me, when I was 30 years old, like they're going to come get you sooner. They're find a way to get you. And it's all about power and money. That's all it's about,
And you've seen this. You've seen declining reimbursements over the past several decades. You've seen increased regulations. You're someone very much in tune with what's going on, and I think your colleagues and our colleagues and some of the societies we're a part of are watching this, and they're involved with certain societies and trying to influence things. But what has the response of the medical profession in general and ophthalmology been like? I feel like there's not been a lot of progress in fighting some of these things.
No, ophthalmologists in general and doctors in general have very little political influence, obviously. You have to look for who you're going to get on your side, and the best people to get on your side is the gray Panthers, the older people, the people that you're actually operating on, because they have a voice and they have, it makes a difference. Because politicians, as you can see, it's all about ideology and governance goes out, and basically finances go in and control. So the whole idea is they want to be reelected, and they will do whatever it takes to be reelected. And doctors, whether they're, on their side or not, they can say, well, look at this doctor. He's making money, and he's at the country club, and he's this. And, they have a way of rebranding anything. You see that today when you're kind of looking and you say, well, who's in power today? And what's the opposition say? The opposition easily says this, right? They're going to basically give tax breaks to the rich, and then they're going to cut Medicare for all the older people. I mean, that's their message. And it's, it's just hammered in. And you say, why? It's because the opposite, they want to get basically the older people on your side. So you're out of luck for doctors. Doctors get up there, and as you said, all our societies, you might as well be talking to Cocker Spaniels. I mean, they do very little about it. They go up there and they come back and they go, well, they were going to cut us like 10%, but it's a success. They only cut us 5%. And the government's very patient. They exercise patience. They just slowly get you. And they kind of go, okay. And it's like this. It's like the negotiations you see. It's we're going to do this to you, and then when you get, it's not as bad as you think. You think you've actually won when actually you're just giving up ground. And that's a bad sign. It's the way it's going. It's not a good sign.
I would imagine it doesn't help that I remember even growing up, junior high, high school, the sentiment was, doctors get paid way too much. No one's empathetic towards the financial situation of doctors. And I feel like that's just kind of more weaponized now, even on social media.
Yeah, they're getting out and they're, hundreds of $1,000s in debt. Most of them cannot do what I did, which is build my own practice because they got to go work for somebody. They're hired. And then, they got to build up through that way or through that mechanism. So for them, it takes a lot longer to get to where they need to get to because they're not in control, and basically they're not necessarily their consensus isn't a personal consensus where we could always pivot on a dime, or we could always decide, get 2 or 3 of us together and decide. They have to have kind of group decisions. And some of these groups are what's best for the older guys in the group and the younger guys. So it's an issue that a lot of people face when they go into practice. It's if you said, "Oh, I want to get out and do private practice and be on my own," that's a very, very rare character, and you would have to find an area that's very underserved to do that. There are areas out there, but a lot of people, they want to come back home or come back to certain urban areas like this where there's a lot of competition. And so they usually charge in with a group that basically can, progressively be part of that competition and, do a lot of things for them that they just want to go in and do their cases. But unfortunately, you're giving up a little bit of control to do that.
Do you think we've seen a decline in the entrepreneurial spirit over the years?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because it's very hard to be when you're looking at what you're doing. A lot of people are trying to balance a little more nowadays their work-life balance. I would say, when I look at my sons who are in it, and I praise them for being better balanced than I was. But the reality of leadership, or to master anything, is sacrifice. That's always the way it is. Leadership is not a privilege. Leadership is a responsibility. People talk about, look at their privileged position. No, it's a responsibility that you have, because you're going to have to basically give up a lot of personal things, personal time, and things like that to be successful. So, the unfortunate thing in life is, if you look at anybody that's been successful on their own volition, that is, then the lack of balance earlier in their life, the balance later in their life, is a direct result of lack of balance earlier in their life. It's just, they have to do that. That's part of what you do. And I don't know of anybody that's ever been truly successful in athletics or politics or business or whatever, who haven't had to sacrifice a lot to basically get to the point that they're at, and that's just, there's a lot of people nowadays that aren't willing to sacrifice. They're just not willing to do that anymore.
Yeah, I saw it even within my own generation growing up, which is, it takes a lot to get into medical school, go through ophthalmology residency, become a surgeon, become board certified, fellowship, all that. Yes, we're not really taught business. We're not taught administrative skills. We're not taught HR. We're not taught creativity in the hard sciences. But I feel like too many are just content with, okay, I'm going to sign up, I'm going to join a hospital, I'm going to join a practice, I'm going to clock in, clock out, not worry about anything else, have no ownership, just get paid a nice salary. And they worry about the risk.
Yeah, and you see that, especially you'll see that a lot with people who are in certain circumstances. But you see also people come over here. Everybody's an immigrant, obviously. My group came over in 1730, though, but we all came over at some point. When my group came over, it was Scotch-Irish, basically. So we got in the towns, and who ran the towns? The English. They didn't get along with the Scotch-Irish. That's why they left Ireland. So they were kind of banished. You could either be a policeman or maybe or a low job, but you got banished to the outside the United States, right? And so my group found a way. And you said, well, what way did they find? Well, when you were in Ireland back then, what did you not have? You didn't own the land. The English owned the land. If you remember, there was the potato famine, correct? And that's a big thing. And I'm sure in history you go, oh, there was a famine. And I'm going to try to collect this to what you said here. And you may go, wait a second. You're an island. And you had forest. And you were raising cattle. And you had game. And you had fish in the sea. How did you starve? How did you starve? Because, a lot of people think, oh, the famine, right? The potato. And you're like, y'all were just eating potatoes. The English took all the food and shipped it to England. And you didn't own the land. You had a choice. So when you got over to the United States, you had a chance. They said, you go out and homestead. You do 100 acres and you grow a crop. And that 100 acres is yours. And that's something that people would live a lifetime to do. So you see immigrants come over here now, Vietnamese. It was various Germans came over in waves. The Sicilians came over in the 1880s. All these people came over with the idea that they're looking for a better life. And a lot of them worked very hard to make it, but they just wanted the opportunity. Well, that's the same thing, connecting it to nowadays. You kind of look at people and you can kind of say, do they have that same spirit? Do they have that same spirit that, their ancestors had when they were, or your ancestors had when, the people came over and they said, listen, I just want to come over here. If I'm willing to work, can I succeed? And they work very hard to do that. Sometimes, to give their children a better life. And, various generations did better and better. There is some thought that the generations now that are in the 21st century that have been here a while don't have that same spirit necessarily. They're looking for a nicer lifestyle earlier than were, and they're not, and basically that sacrifice isn't, quote, up as high on the menu as it was back in those days. The greatest generation might have been World War II, and all those kids had to go over there and die. And now, so these are the types of things that have kind of diluted through society. Are you willing to sacrifice? We see the same thing today. When people say, what are we doing? Why are we changing our plans? And people say, well, let's look at China. They produce, the majority, a huge amount of our drugs. They have 90% of the precious minerals that we need. They make a lot of the chips that we have. And they're kind of almost our sworn enemy. So you're kind of like, well, maybe it's not a good idea that we can't function if these guys are having all that. Like, what do we need to do? And then unfortunately, in situations like that, you're looking at a sacrifice. And sometimes people aren't willing to sacrifice to get to that. And if they don't, there will be consequences. And, that's the sort of thing. So that's more of a generational thing. I try to I taught all my children. They did well. But I had a lot of rules for them. And yes, I gave them a lot of pluses when they did well. If they didn't do well, then, it's kind of like, you're not going to believe what happens next. And it worked. And, I try to give the same rules to my grandchildren and, and teaching them, what's going on and why they're doing this. They're nowadays the philosophies are completely different. People look at fault all the time. Whose fault is this? Who's the fault? The lawyers basically they're there is ever search for a victim. So people have victimhood. And it really, I told my grandson the other day when he was talking about something, my 10-year-old grandson, his little sister had done something, and I told him to clean it up. He said it wasn't his fault. And I said, it's your responsibility. And I said, that's leadership. I said, fault and responsibility are two different things. I said, leaders take responsibility. A lot of people do things, it's not their fault, but they realize that they wanted things better and they want that how things need to be done, and they take responsibility for it. So I had to give him the lesson of fault versus responsibility. And a lot of people are blown away, just even adults are like, you mean if the streets looks bad, I might have to go out and pick up some garbage or do this. I might have to do something actually above and beyond something that I didn't create. And that's the reality of everything is that you're going to have to sacrifice. You're going to have to take responsibility. And there's fewer and fewer people in this day and age that seem to be willing to do that. It's highly publicized like that's something that you shouldn't have to do.
It's obvious to me you've made a lot of sacrifices in your life and your career to build what you've built and to establish sort of the generational pathway you have for your family. I want to go back, though, to the early days of the ASC because I think a lot of those lessons are applicable to some of the younger generation that's interested in maybe going solo today in practice or going into OBS or ASC. So when you first built the ASC, how long was it before you felt like it was kind of running successfully on its own? And did you see others look at your example and then try and replicate that?
Yeah, I mean, people obviously thought that we were going to fail. They wanted us to fail. We had a lot of people against us, all the hospitals, this and that, and they thought all the odds were against us. But I feel more empowered when all the odds are against me. That's just always the way I felt. It's kind of like I would rather it all be against me because then, in most things in life, that basically derives commitment. You make a commitment. And what people have to understand about life and about a lot of things is often the most committed win. So the reality is that's something in life that you have to learn. You have to have a pure commitment to things. And it made us, we got ourselves out on an edge, and it made us have to commit ourselves to that. And we worked really hard to do that, and we became kind of leaders in the field. And leadership from the standpoint is meaning that we were influencers. So what we did, people would watch, and they would go, look at those guys. They're doing it. Maybe I can do it. That sort of thing. And and like my son Blake's doing a lot of talks back in the days. I had to do all these talks. What I call KOL speeches nowadays, I call my day at camp talks, basically. That's what it is. Nobody does a KOL speech. You don't sit there and listen to KOL speech and go, oh my God, I've never heard anything. I've never heard this before, right? Because in a lot of these meetings, you're talking to the masses, and if you did a KOL speech at this meeting that we were just at, 300-400 people, I don't know how many people were in the audience, knowing full well that 80% of them weren't going to do anything that you said. You're kind of teaching them, or you're preaching to them, because refractive surgery has been on decline, progressive decline. So the total market of what you're doing has been stagnant for years, and now it's kind of had a blip, and now it's on a decline. It's all refractive surgery, and LASIK is on a decline, and nobody's really addressing it. Nobody has any address, just not directly. Like, we got to stop this market. It's like, and they're always like, how good am I doing? Not how good our market is doing, our industry is doing. But that is eventually going to affect you if you don't address that. So yeah, we became, leaders not because we became leaders because we took action. So taking action is the most important thing you do. People say, how do you get empathy? How do you get patience? You have to exhibit empathy before you become empathetic. You have to exhibit patience before you have patience. People say, oh, look at this soldier. He saved these people. He got Medal of Honor. He was very brave. He's braver than the rest of us. That's not true. that's not the way courage works. The way courage works is you act, and once you do the action you do, you just, and every Medal of Honor winner will tell you this. I saw and I had to act. They acted, and after they act, people looked at them. That made them courageous. So people think it's the reverse. You're courageous, and that made you act. Acts always precede. Action always precede some sort of value you have. So if you're sitting there waiting, it's never going to occur. You act, and that will get you where you need to be. That's the value. You don't get values. They're just not bestowed upon you. You have to go, but only through actions can you have values.
Yeah, I guess it's similar if someone looks at Williamson Eye and they're like, well, this has been around a while. It's self-sustaining. It didn't just get there by accident. You had to build that.
Yeah, it was hard. It was hard to build, and it took years. And now we have 8 centers and a lot of surgeons and this and that. But I felt privileged because my father was an optometrist there, and at one point he had 5 offices, and so it wasn't. And my brother was 4 years older than me, so it wasn't like I didn't have some sort of a legacy when I got in there. But when I got in there, I was like, well, what can I contribute? And then it was that way with my third brother. My third brother came in. He's 60, so he's a lot younger. And his idea was, what can I contribute? And at that time, that's when I built the cosmetic center. We came from my same residency that had a big oculoplastics program. And we were doing, my daughter, who was a PA, was running that. We're doing facial cosmetics and injectables and things like that. And we built that now into a huge, we have, a couple of plastic surgeons that work for us in 6 centers. And that's been around 25 years now. And they do pretty much every cosmetic procedure you can do. Now, I don't do any of those. But my older brother started, and you say, well, what made an ophthalmologist start? The first guy that basically did CO2 laser around the eyes was a guy named Sterling Rice in Oklahoma. He was an ophthalmologist. So these little crow's feet, you can't do it with an eye tuck. You basically did CO2 laser. So I sent him out there, and he looked at that, and it kind of went from there. And there's lasers on the face, and there's all these things, and we could pretty much do everything. And that's all cash business. So that's another business called the Williamson Cosmetic Center that I built and from the ground up. And we were doing it at the same time, of course, that we had the other thing. So as you know, we're trying to basically look at these cash centers that we're doing with refractive surgery and cosmetic.
So you mentioned how you grew up in a generation that was doing everything.
Yeah.
Probably today, when people think Chuck Williamson, they think a lot of things, but at least in terms of subspecialty, they're thinking refractive and cataract.
Yeah.
Where along the journey did you decide, okay, let the retina guys do retina, maybe I'm not going to do oculoplastics. Let me focus on cataract, refractive, and build that?
It's a time thing because, you'll never become wealthy doing what you're doing unless you invest your money. In other words, if you said, hey, I'm in the personal service business. I don't care what business you're in. If you work by personal services, at some point, you only have so much time. And, at some point that basically starts to level off because you're giving, you can't do twice as much. You can't work 24 hours a day. And so basically what happens is that, that your production or how much money you're going to bring in. Yes. And so what I say is you make good money, meaning that you can have a nice lifestyle as long as you keep working and never stop working. And you go, well, how do I retire? How do I do this? And you have to build something else that makes money while you're sleeping or just outside of you. Or some people invest in the stock market. I have friends that invest in the stock market. But, to do that, you got to, save. You got to do this. You got to do a lot of other things business-wise. I was doing retina, not because I thought I was the best retinal surgeon in the world, but there were no retinal people in my town. You had to go to New Orleans. And there was a certain amount of people that was like in Louisiana's a poor state. That was like telling them to go to Mars. And they were going, I'm not doing that. Now, a lot of and I had the skills to do that. I'd learned to do that. But, I was realizing that, one practice doesn't necessarily support a retinal surgeon, a surgical retinal person. And it was like, these cases were longer, and I would be a lot rather be doing cataracts and doing things like that. Well, when those cataracts came up and people started to move in, my friend of mine went back and got a fellowship in retina and came back, and I said, oh, thank God. Now he can do all the retina. And, and then the DCRs and the oculoplastics, once again, oh, I can get rid of those. And we started to fill that up with lasers and refractive surgery and things like that that were more beneficial to our time. We still do some oculoplastics, and of course we do MIGS and glaucoma in those populations. But we were doing everything at one point because, we were general ophthalmologists, but being trained that way, we have a very good knowledge of everything in the eye and all those procedures and how that works. And in the same way as medicine, I was trained in medicine. I actually became board certified in emergency medicine too. At the same time, I was board certified in ophthalmology. I worked in emergency rooms.
How did you pull that off?
Back in the day, you could work emergency rooms immediately in Louisiana when you graduated from basically medical school. And we made very little. I showed my kids my residency contract. It was $9,700 a year. And at that time, I had, 3 kids, and a wife that worked as a medical technician. And we didn't have a lot of money, but we got $20 an hour to work the worst emergency rooms you could work. So sometimes I would work 60 hours in emergency rooms from Friday morning all the way through in some of these emergency rooms. And the worse emergency rooms you worked, the more it was cash money. And I'd work that all through my residency. So 4 years when at that time, you're talking, 40-something years ago, 45 years ago, emergency medicine then all of a sudden was going to become a specialty. So what they had to do is, like most organizations, they grandfathered people in, and they said, if you worked at least so long in the last 3 years, you can come take a test, and we'll grandfather you in if you have these hours. Well, I had the hours and everything, and I was good at tests, so I took it and everything. So people, it was one of my exam rooms. They said, you were board certified emergency room doctor at the same time you were board certified ophthalmologist. I said, yeah, that was a lot of work, but that was what paid the bills basically. And, but I enjoyed it because basically I had to deal with everything that's different than emergency rooms nowadays. It was really kind of a mash, there's a lot of things we had no MRIs. We didn't have a lot of the specialty stuff that you have now. So, you name it, I did it. I cracked chest. I did, sucking chest wounds. I delivered 6-month footling breeches and rushing to a hospital that had a neonatal care unit, stopping along the way with little, TB syringes made up with my drugs and, for this little kids. And so all of the worst things that you can imagine, I did. Gunshot wounds, car wrecks, everything. And, but, it was good because, ophthalmology seemed like a vacation, after you did all that.
Yeah, talk to me about the early days of cataract surgery. Cataract surgery today looks very different than it did, back when you were going through training. Talk to me back then.
Yeah, I did I started off doing intracaps. For those people that don't understand what intracaps are, I've never seen one. Basically, it's almost 180-degree incision. You put some alpha chymotrypsin in, which dissolves basically the zonules of the lens. And then, and we used, they had a risifake, which is basically a little suction instrument. You could suck on the lens. And a guy named Kelman, who did phaco, helped popularize the ice ball. So there was a little pin kind of you would push, and you could freeze onto the thing. And then you would tease the lens out, slowly rocking it back and forth. It was no longer held in position by any zonules, but the vitreous was still on it. So you'd see the vitreous as you're slowly pulling it out. You'd see the vitreous kind of clinging to that area, in the back, where embryonically it's there, and you're like, kind of holding your breath, hoping the vitreous doesn't come too. Unfortunately, you're in a very vulnerable position then. Vitreous can come out, retina can come out. So people, even in extra caps and a lot of things, people like expulsive hemorrhages, things like that. So a lot of times when you drop the pressure in these older people with these fragile vessels, the choroidal vessels break and this comes up, and everybody's seen it in choroidals and a lot of other things. But when you had the eye open, you were very vulnerable. You had to be ready to sew it down very fast. So you pre-placed sutures and started sewing as fast as you can. Then came extra caps, and then came phaco. And I was lucky. A lot of my life was luck. Okay, meaning that the most prized feature that Napoleon liked in his generals was luck. You had to have luck, and you can see people who win championships. You go, well, it takes this, it takes that, but it also takes a bit of luck. So the reality is that I was lucky. So during my time, happens to be the residency, later 70s, early 80s, right through there, was the time that all those transitions were taking place. IOLs were coming in, and everybody was putting in a 19 lens, 19 power lens, standard lenses, and that came from the old days when lenses were first put in, of basically the surprise, because people didn't have lens formulas. They didn't understand that. And I kind of did my own calculations of people according to whether they were nearsighted or farsighted. I would kind of move that around and learn to do it. And then, formulas came in and those sorts of things came in. But I was lucky because I got to see everything. I got to do extra caps, and I know how to do them if I need to do them. Intracaps, obviously, most people don't do anymore. And then when phaco came, I was in the early part of phaco. So we had to phaco what we call dance on the pedals, because as soon as you stop, and when you had the suction basically going, as soon as the piece of nucleus cleared into the phaco tip, the whole anterior chamber collapsed, almost came down. So you had to immediately be able to come off of it. So you were like dancing on the pedals in all the directions, and you really learned how to do that with a lot of finesse, so that later on, when they had the ability to kind of keep not have this collapse and stuff like that, it was like, God, this is easy compared to what we had to do. It was great. Some of the guys early on, the lenses that first came out, the first lens that was approved by the FDA was an anterior chamber lens. But we did very few anterior chamber lenses. We did posterior chamber lenses, because that came out pretty early too. It wasn't approved. Well, we were doing unapproved lenses. Yeah, we were doing unapproved lenses. Put them in. But back then, it wasn't like that. You didn't have to have, FDA approval to do that. So you were putting in these stiffer lenses, and then basically the ones that had the Silco lenses that had, softer loops and things like that in the posterior chamber. And we learned to do phacos. First phaco I did was a completely white cataract. A lot of sweat on that table because, that my attending didn't even know that, maybe that might be a hard position. And, you're phacoing and you have no visualization basically. So, all those things, later on, those skills that you had that were very tough, when the machines made it easier for you, surgery became easier, things became easier, perception became easier. And I always tell people when they do surgery, I said, listen, this is the only time in your life that you're going to be totally in control as much as you can. The music you want, there's an eye there, and that eye, you have to visualize yourself as big as a basketball gym. 1 or 2 millimeters movement is like way over there. So it's reality. Your reality becomes very different there. And you can kind of increase your surgery skills by just your perception. Your brain, basically, that's the way it learns. It learns to kind of blur the edges, like, retinal ganglion cells can basically improve vision by sharpening their edges. Retinal ganglion cells on their own can basically sharpen edges, blurred edges. So they kind of learn. That's how, if we get into neuroadaptation, that's how neuroadaptation works. Well, that's how all adaptation works. That's how people throw passes, people hit a baseball. You adapt to something, and surgery is much the same way. Once you really spend time in there and looking and kind of paying attention, not to just one thing, but paying attention. You kind of see the whole field, as athletes say. They go out there and they say, I'm concentrated like this, and then one day I see it all. I see the whole field. And that's what you do at some point when you become experienced in surgery.
Yeah, tell me about your mindset during surgery. Do you find yourself in a flow state? And as you've noticed, as you've seen your kids go through and become ophthalmologists, what was sort of the guidance you gave them about the mentality behind operating?
Well, the first guidance to them was, in order for you to be really good at something, you have to essentially know all the known facts that are out there. That's the first thing you do. The first thing you do is you know all the known facts. It requires a lot of study, because a lot of people nowadays are just saying, well, what's the latest lens, and what's that, and what's the A constant, and what's that? Well, that's just simple stuff. That's simple things. But basically knowing everything about the eye, everything you can possibly learn, because then you're at the edges of your knowledge. So then you kind of work from there, and you're better. And that's how you get better. You don't get better by just saying, well, here's a lens, I'm going to put it in. You get better by basically understanding everything that's presently out there, and then realizing that you can start working from those edges, and you can become creative in that way. And then once you get comfortable at it, and there's people that, just like athletes, there's people that have a better adaptation to surgery, hand-eye coordination. And the big thing is patience and attitude. They have the patience, they have the attitude because they're in control of the operating room. Everything there, as I said, fault versus responsibility. It's all your responsibility. And I would tell Blake when he first started, I made him do the first year kind of as a fellowship with me. And I said, if a 747 crashes through this operating room and some people are dead and there's burning oil, finish the operation. That's what you're there for. Do your job. That's your job. So that's kind of the way great football players learn, is they're all part of a team effort, and they have a job, and they have to be excellent at that job. They can't stray from that attitude. So basically, once you get to that point, you say, now I'm a very busy surgeon. What's happening? Well, look around you. You have all this help. You have all these people. They're getting paid by the hour. And you're driving them as hard as you can. So you want to make that a pleasant experience. So my job, when I'd go into operating rooms for most of my career, was to make the staff happy, to talk to them. Hey, how's your son? What are they doing? Talking about people, playing the music you want, joking with them. And you would say, well, what happens when the situation gets tight? What happens if you're starting a phaco and then all of a sudden you notice, whoa, the zonules are not there on this side. The lens is starting to move and this and that. Suddenly I'm not changing my demeanor. I'm just kind of slowly starting to ask for different instruments. I'm doing different things. And the nurse, they know what it is. So they kind of pick up. It wasn't there. Now, some people have a different idea about surgery. They turn out all the lights and they act like this is some hallowed deal. We have fun. We have a great time. And when we see things that are difficult, it almost makes us smile a little bit, because you're doing a procedure that's generally, going to be successful. And then when you see this complication, often you kick yourself because you should have seen it before, or you did something that you normally don't do. You become a little more carefree with doing something. You're not watching. So the reality is that, you kind of remind yourself, I'll never let that happen again. So basically, you're kind of doing these things, but you're getting out of that complication. And it's very hard for surgeons sometimes, because we live in a world in which complications and endophthalmitis and things are rare. So how many cases do you have to do to experience enough complications so that you become an expert at recognizing them and working with them ahead of time? You have to do a lot. So guys with a lot of experience, what we say is we learn from our mistakes. And then, just like a quarterback that throws 2 or 3 interceptions and comes back and wins the game, you learn basically to forget your mistakes and go forward on the next case. So that's an important mentality. You got to have that kind of mentality, like a great field general or great quarterback. But you also have the great mentality of leadership, of rallying those people around you, because you know your job. And when you become really good at it, you realize, I need to make these people like their jobs, like working for me. And it just creates a great environment and a fun day for you. And it's a tiring day, but it's the kind of tired day that you kind of appreciate.
Let's dive a little bit more into complications, because the early days of cataract surgery, where you're freezing the nucleus and levitating it up into the AC, there's a lot of complications. Thankfully, modern technology, surgical techniques.
Yeah. I mean, try sewing having a cornea off, and then the patient basically has a myocardial infarction, and basically is being basically people are pushing on their chest. They're doing this while you're sewing the cornea as fast as you get the cornea on to sew this. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that have happened to me over the years. I've seen them all to some degree, and you learn to recognize them. And a lot of times you learn to kind of recognize them before they happen. You're just kind of looking at things. And a lot of times it's kind of a snowball thing, as you notice, you get in there and you go, oh, well, this patient isn't quite dilated enough. And this, it's kind of like one thing, and then it leads to another, and then it leads to another, and it leads to another. And that's the same way that you would see, I got a pilot's license in my early days. And I used to read the back of a flying magazine, and it always was the same thing. It was this instructional case of, it was a beautiful day in North Carolina, and the pilot came down, he got in his plane, and he was going to have this flight over to here, and it was just a gorgeous day, and everything was fine. Of course, it ended up weather moving in and this and that, and at one point, the guy had lost all of his, all the electronics, all everything, and, he was flying blind, and it was incredible that he kept the plane aloft for 2 hours, and then he finally crashed and died. So you're kind of like, you're looking at that, and you kind of realize that in any situation you're in, especially when you're relying on technology, and then you have a human element there, that things are going to go wrong. And the more cases you do, the more complications you're going to see. And you just, you're trying to prepare yourself for them.
Surgery's borrowed a lot from aviation in terms of standardization, standard operating procedure, timeouts. Talk to me about that, because I'm sure that wasn't around in the early days. It was kind of just, let's do it.
Yeah, we didn't have a lot of that timeout and different things, and speaking to people, but a lot of that was instituted because of not just because of ophthalmology. It was basically in medicine itself, with people operating on the wrong leg and things like that, and it's so all those things became slowly instituted into what you're doing, and a lot of them were good things to have. A lot of them were fine to do that, because you're doing cases so quickly that your keys, a lot of times, of the most important part is just the errors of people basically putting the wrong numbers down or something. That was it. So you're a lot of that, though, when you have good staff. Everybody usually has their second in command that works with them, and extremely. I've always been fortunate to have somebody with a lot of experience. They knew better. They knew the formulas better than I did. So basically, I haven't picked my lens in 25 years. 25 years. The person I have with me is better at picking the lens than I am. They know everything. They stay up on everything. They know the ins and outs of all of that. I'll look at it and she'll explain it to me. But it's kind of those things that you depending on the type of personnel you have. I have really, really, really experienced people that are with me, and that's a big benefit. Once you kind of train those types of people.
We just came back from ASCRS, which ended today in Los Angeles, and a few of the sessions I was in, it was interesting. So much of the conversations around, well, what's the rate of 20/20 on day one or week one? Recovery for patients now after cataract surgery and refractive surgery is fantastic. The recovery division is phenomenal. you just described the early days of cataract surgery and what was that was like. Talk about the patient experience, because from my understanding, patients used to have to stay in the hospital for a week, sandbags around the head.
Yeah, patients were sandbagged in the old days because they had 180-degree incisions, big incisions, and they stayed in the hospital longer. You didn't even look at them on the slit lamp. You didn't even bring them to the slit lamp. You pin lighted them. When the early days of phaco, you said, well, weren't you worried about phacoing? Phaco was banned in a lot of states because people did it poorly and destroyed the endothelium, and some people said, oh, it's a terrible operation. And the early days of phaco, you would take a pin light and you would look at the patient laying in bed. You wouldn't take them to a slit lamp, and you would say, see iris details. That meant the cornea was clear enough that you could actually see some iris details. So that meant your corneal edema wasn't as bad. So, certainly as you said, the requirements have gone a long way since then, and but the machines are better, and the likelihood that you're going to be able to, you got viscoelastic. We didn't have that then. You have a lot of other stuff that we didn't have. So basically, the patient themselves, a lot of them were very happy because cataracts were allowed to go a lot further. People were a lot worse before they had cataract surgery, because early on they were going to be in glasses or contacts if they could wear them. A lot of them couldn't wear contacts. So the reality is that you didn't, obviously you didn't do 20/40 cataracts or 20/30 cataracts. That's not what you did, or cataracts that would glare down. Nowadays that functionality, has gotten a lot worse. People expect a lot more. They're coming to you and basically they're saying, under certain conditions, here's what they can't see. And, so their expectations are a lot higher. And, and a lot of it's come now to setting expectations about what they want and trying to decide with that patient, that particular patient, are they going to have reasonable expectations about what they're going to get? Now, obviously, it's a different story if there's some issues in there, you don't hit the mark, or there's some other issues and that you have to correct. But there's plenty of times that patients have such unreasonable expectations that you could have a perfect result and they're kind of like still not happy with it. But you have to basically weed those people out ahead of time, and that's kind of that's the best job that I do, is talking to the patient. I haven't. He said, well, what do? You got all these records that are EMR records. I haven't literally pushed a button to turn on a computer in maybe, I don't know, forever. I don't like computers. I don't like them. I can think faster than a computer can think. People start typing in and they start banging on things, and I kind of, it's like my son's banging on calculators to get the result, and I can do math in my head. So I don't do that. I have people, they have the tablet and they're pushing on that. So my job is to talk to the patient, to touch the patient. I touch them and ask them. I never go in and start reading things off the chart. Never do that. You already know. Most of what we do, you already know the answer when you walk in the room. Be frank. You already know the answer. But I walk in the answer and I just say, hey, how you doing? How's your vision? That's all I ask. When people say, I'm great, I see great. You kind of know that idea right then is no matter if you see they have a 20/30 cataract or 20/25 cataract minus and they glare to 20/60, you kind of go, okay, well, this is, they're not in here just complaining like I'm terrible. They may have been sent by my ODs who noticed this, and they kind of notice, yeah, something's wrong a little bit. So then, there becomes a period where you sit down and you kind of approach that patient, a little bit differently, and that, you don't get into, well, Mrs. Smith, you're 20/25 and you glare to this, and, it's a tragedy. A lot of times I kind of just go through it and explain to them, and in a way that you talk to them well enough, and you should be able to, if you can't tell the patient within a few minutes, and they can understand fully the most difficult of procedures, then you can't do their surgery. I mean, it's just not that. I always tell people, no matter how difficult it is, I have a lot of people in Louisiana. There are a lot of people that never finished even high school. So I can explain that to them so that they understand quite well what's going on. And I think they come at ease at that. They come how you're talking to them, how you spend time with them, and explain to them, what to expect if they're going to have this. But reasonably set this too. You're not if somebody has minimal problems and they're complaining a lot, and you don't see the reasons for that complaint, then a lot of times it's personality issues. And I've told people before, we could do this and this and this, but I just don't think you're psychologically suited for it. And I explained to them. Most of them know that. Most patients that come in, and you see them before your technicians say, oh, this patient was rude to us, or they did this, or they did that. And they get to you, and you're the doctor. So they've learned, those types of people sometimes have learned to straighten up when they get in front of authority. And they need to hey, I need to throw the old speedball by him. I need to act like, honey, it's on my tongue, and it's going to be so good. But I recognize them right away, and I just look them straight in the eye, and I just say, I'm sure you're used to this, and I'm sure you're used to this situation, but this isn't the way it works here. So the good part about it is that I'm never, ever pushing to tell people they need to have surgery. It's not a conversion, it's a conversation. And I'm very, very honest with them up front, and I can tell when people don't want to have surgery, and I can tell when people want to have surgery. So I'm never trying to talk anybody into surgery. And I guess, we do enough procedures that that's not an issue for us anymore. And it works out in the long run. It works out the best to do that. So you have to read, you have to be a very good people person. You have to read people very, very well. And I'm good at reading people,
Yeah. I view you as a keeper of ophthalmic history. So I want to talk about a lot of the business aspects of modern refractive cataract surgery. But maybe first, can you take us back to when IOLs first came out and the reception in Louisiana? Was there any pushback against implants going into the eye at first?
Of course, yeah. I mean, when you came out and you did implants, people like Troutman, Richard Troutman, who was a very famous New York corneal surgeon, said it's a time bomb in the eye. And there was a lot of negativity about that. But, if I'm going to take you back into history and refractive surgery, you have to understand the business of why ophthalmology became a specialty in the first place. And it was always about refraction. It was always about refraction. The first thing, if you look at astigmatism, George Airy basically discovered the cylinder lens in 1825. By 1846, Wheeler was the one who coined the term astigmatism. In the late 1800s, Bates learned that basically if you did an incision, basically on the cornea, that you could change the curvature of the cornea in the meridian of the incision, but it didn't change the curvature in the opposite, in the meridian 90 degrees away. The first guy to do an AK, not really an AK, it was actually a full thickness corneal incision, was a guy named Schiotz, and I'm sure you heard of the Schiotz tonometer. So Schiotz in 1895 basically did a full thickness corneal incision and corrected 12 diopters of astigmatism. So most of what the surgical ideas about astigmatism, and the meridians where it changed, what it is, what cylinder lenses were done in the 1800s. They were done in the 1800s. In the early 1900s, people were taking out people with -10s that had -10, -11. They were taking the whole lens out where the patient was Plano. So they were purely for refractive reasons, right? And of course they, had a lot of retinal detachments and things like that, which put a stop to that process. But if you said, why did ophthalmology today, the American Board of Ophthalmology recognizes no specialties and subspecialties. The American Board of Medical Specialties, which is 1933 owned, has 24 boards, 150 specialties. Under that, there are only two that have no specialty, ophthalmology and nuclear medicine. And when it started, ophthalmology was the first in 1913. And you said, well, explain to me why, if everybody that got out just had an MD degree, there were no specialties. There was no officially recognized heart specialist, no officially recognized urologist, nobody. You just had an MD degree or you didn't, one of the two. And then obviously you got some specialized training in one way or another, and either, maybe it wasn't called a fellowship back then, it was called a preceptorship or whatever. You worked with people. But the thing that drove ophthalmology to become the first specialty of all medical specialties, the first one, was money. Money and refraction. Because what happened is, we just talked about lenses. Glasses became a thing. Suddenly, people were selling glasses. People were selling lenses, and they were called oculists. So these oculists, if you were a general practitioner in those days, you didn't know much about the eye. And people would come to you, and maybe they had an infection, or you had this, or you had that, and you dealt with it. But you really didn't know much about it. You didn't care much about it because it was kind of something that was just, you just didn't have a lot of knowledge about. But suddenly, all of these guys who were called oculists in the late 1800s began making fairly significant money by selling people eyeglasses. So they were doing vision correction. So if you're in the industry of vision correction, suddenly people were going to these eye people, just like going to opticals nowadays. And when they were there, they were also saying, well, I've got this other problem with my eye. And so these oculists became very good at basically looking at eye disease because that's all they dealt with is the eye. Whereas the general guy got, well, this is horrible. Not only are these people practicing medicine, but they're making money by correcting people's vision. And I want to do that. So what happened was their court case ensued, went all the way to the Supreme Court in the early 1900s. And the court decision came down and said, okay, these oculists, they can do glasses and contacts later, obviously, but they can't do any surgery. They can't do any medicine. If you're an ophthalmologist, if you're this person, you can do medicine and you can do glasses and you can do surgery. You can do all of that. So when that division occurred, the oculists said, well, you know what we're going to do is create our own school, and we're going to be called optometrist. So the first optometry schools came out, meaning that they were going to do training now and start to have certifications and qualifications for those people, because they said, we'll be more qualified than the general practitioners. So ophthalmology suddenly started to come into being at that time in the early days. But there were very few places you could be trained in the United States. A lot of times you have to go to Europe to be trained and come back. And as time went on, you had basically everybody doing extracapsular cataract surgeries, things like that. That was kind of done in the early days. And then, of course, the first intraocular lens, as we move up, was done in 1947. So Harold Ridley, had the idea, as everybody knows the story. The fighter pilots came back from World War II with perspex, in their eye, this from the canopies, thing, and they were kind of inert. And they said, a medical student said, well, and when they saw a lens removed and they were going to put on the glasses, they said, well, wouldn't it be great if you put in another lens? So Harold Ridley kind of kept it quiet because that was obviously against all general, basically ophthalmology at that time wouldn't approve of that. And he kept his experiments and everything that he did very quietly. But what a lot of people don't realize was that when the lens was put in November 1947, it was not a lens with a primary surgery. The extracapsular cataract surgery was done. Harold Ridley done the extracapsular cataract surgery 3 months prior. He put in the first implant lens, was actually a secondary implant. Not knowing not knowing a formula or what the implant power was, he had a refractive surprise of -10 on that patient. So 2 months after that, he removed that lens and put in another lens, and the patient ended up being -1. So the first implant was actually the first secondary implant. It was the first refractive surprise and the first lens exchange. So those things basically were interesting because that was all in the same patient, right? Of course, he was derided and by all the people that were basically ran ophthalmology for about 20 years. But implants just exploded. A lot of them anterior chamber implants, a lot of them phakic implants. A lot of the Italians and people putting in phakic implants, trying to correct vision from a refractive standpoint, which obviously, there was glaucoma, inflammation, things like that. So those things kind of went to the wayside. It wasn't until the 1970s that finally implants got to a point to safety and he was, suddenly, basically hailed as, a pioneer in that. But he spent 20 years in the wilderness before he got to that point. And then, once the implants came in, it changed everything because all the old guard who were against implants, it just swept over them. And suddenly it just exploded. So you had this practice forever, and suddenly the young guy down the street that was doing implants and lasers and then, eventually phaco and everything, he literally, he used to have to work 20 years to take the practice, and that's the way it happened. So it changed everything quite quickly, immediately, if you will, and kind of went all the way to, till nowadays to who has the latest technology and who has the latest thing and things like that. But it changed the way the order, if you will, the hierarchy in our specialty.
Jim Loden does a great job at the meetings we go to breaking down the dollars and cents of ophthalmology. And a lot of his reports, unfortunately, are bleak and kind of depressing. But he's essentially postured that a general ophthalmology practice that's not doing refractive cataract surgery is likely going to become insolvent, at least in today's day and age in 2025. Talk to me about the business of refractive cataract surgery and sort of the blessing that was being able to correct astigmatism, do non-government reimbursed cataract surgery, and charge sort of a fee for giving patients range of vision and maybe a higher quality of vision than they otherwise would.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't the first thing that came out. As you know, RK kind of came out before that. So keratofractive surgery supplanted that, right? I mean, the first implants, the first toric implant, I think, was 1990 or something like that. It was in the late 80s or early 90s, but you had RK before that. I probably did 20,000 RKs, kind of the gift that keeps on giving, as we call it nowadays. Which, strangely, the patients, even when you see them nowadays, they could be a +2 and they could say, that's the best procedure I ever had. They love it. There's, you don't see the thing. And so all of those things came out. ICL, excimer lasers, the basis of the excimer laser was actually created in the early 1900s. But it was the 1980s when the excimer laser was, they would have excimer laser meetings and people would show up. Basically when they showed up, there was mainly a theoretical type of thing. Oh, we can do this and we can carve the cornea, and it'll never change. So LASIK, or the idea of PRK first, and then LASIK. The idea was born in that to do keratofractive surgery. The implants, you were basically could not, a Medicare patient, you couldn't charge them any more than what Medicare allows. And the guy that changed that was a guy named Andy Corley. Andy Corley went to the government and spent a lot of time and a lot of effort knowing that this future was coming and knowing that there would be specialty implants. So what he wanted to do, and his argument was very valid, the whole idea was, once again, looking at the gray Panthers, like, we're denying people who want to pay cash over and above their Medicare benefits to have better vision. We have better implants, but under the reimbursements, we can't, these patients, Medicare won't reimburse this. So, but we do have the technology. So if I have the technology to improve these people in Medicare age, to improve their vision, and they're willing to pay for it on their own, then they ought to be allowed to. And we can have basically what we call balanced billing, right? Meaning that, we'll accept insurance and we'll also bill over. And just the same, if they don't want to go and, if they're notified and they don't want to use Medicare at all, that they can pay cash. So Andy Corley is the guy that, we need to thank for that. He got that. He got it. And basically the idea for the, for the lens, basically. And, that now has obviously, gone through the industry and basically they've been the basis of everything we do with refractive surgery, saying that we're going to do balanced billing surgery. If your insurance pays, that's fine, but here's what the cost of that is. And you can set those costs and set the patient expectations and so forth and so on. So that's been a godsend to save us in medicine, because all of medicine has been reduced. The orthopedic surgeons have been cut by 33%. We've been cut terribly over the years. So, we're looking for ways to basically, all this technology is coming out. If people are willing to pay for it, lens technology or keratofractive technology, then, we want to be able to deliver it. And that's the way now that you're staying afloat. If you do not do that, you're going to be relegated to, being basically a glorified optometrist, That's just going to be, you're not going to be able to kind of make a living doing that. And, I'm not saying that, I'm saying that, it's something that the federal government wouldn't mind. You say, well, why don't they mind? Why would they mind that? They're not having to basically, they're not paying the extra amount. They're not paying the extra, the dollars, the patient's paying the dollars. The government's all about control, and they want to control physicians. That's the way they feel that they can be best, and that they have that control if they can control the hospitals, and if they work for hospitals or work for clinics or things like that, or be in their control. So there's a never-ending desire that, even though if you have this other end, you say, what's wrong with this CMS coming in and cutting your fees down that the insurance pays? They're still, that's their job. They're still looking around ways of, reducing healthcare costs. And as far as they're concerned, all healthcare costs for any reason. So they're looking still for control. And that's, that's why we need to basically be advocates for patients, not advocates for ourselves. Because if we advocate ourselves, they just look at us like, you just want to make more money. But if we advocate for the patients and what it's done, then they have to basically pay attention to that. They have to pay attention to the patients. And that's where our value lies. And that's why we got killed in LASIK in the early days, when people suddenly, hey, I'm no longer an ophthalmologist, I'm a LASIK surgeon. And they started having LASIK mills, and people started doing pricing and saying $300 LASIK. And, that didn't set well with the public. We didn't, it was like the lawyers, we kind of created this, our own industry created that. And all of this, to some degree, when it came to keratofractive surgery, the optometrists were out there, and we were also, remember, as surgeons, we no longer wanted to be primary care, right? We no longer want to be involved in that. So who saw them? The optometrists. So the optometrists would see 80% refractive cases, meaning they were coming in doing, hey, I think I need glasses or contacts. They made about 60% of their money on that. And 20% pathology. We were doing 80% pathology and about 20% of the other stuff, because we abdicate that. So if the optometrist, if they make the majority of their income, 60%, on glasses and contacts, and you're doing a procedure that specifically gets them out of glasses and contacts, no matter what you say, you're at odds, So it's a transactional thing, and so that's the way it is. And then now you're in a position when people kind of start talking about, well, we have optometric referrals. It's hard for me to believe. I've never really seen any optometrists actively refer. They passively refer, meaning the patient said, oh, I'm going to get this done. Oh, let me go let you see this guy, and he'll do it, and then I'll co-manage. So that's the issue nowadays. That's the issue that we're facing that within our industry.
I'm fascinated by the history of keratofractive surgery. We've talked about IOLs. Let's go back, because I'm sitting in front of maybe one of the most prolific RK surgeons in the country. So can you talk me through the early days of RK, and did you ever have any interactions with Fyodorov?
Oh, yeah. I was good friends with Fyodorov. I went over in the early 1990s. Slava, we called him. That was his nickname. He basically, he was the guy who, actually, it was his assistant. It was a surgeon who was basically in practice with him. Yanilev at the time was the first guy that did RKs. RKs really started in the 30s with Sato in Japan. Sato in Japan noticed that people that had Decimase breaks, basically, that they would have keratoconus, people like that, they would notice that area would flatten, when the breaks healed. So he went in and with a knife he did endothelial side radial cuts, flattening the cornea and obviously changing the corneal shape. That was even carried to the 30s and the 40s and even to the 50s. Unfortunately, it was so disastrous that there was so much bullous keratopathy and so forth that it was quit. And even in Japan today, the memory of that has kept cataract refractive surgery down to a minimum in Japan, even though it's pretty high in China. In Japan, it's kind of that hangs over their heads. So Yanilev basically did it in the 70s, and then Fyodorov took over from there and actually started to, popularize radial keratotomy. It was brought over to the United States by a guy named Leo Boris, who went to before when there was the old Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain. He went over there, and he brought it back to the United States, and in those times we learned to do, it became very popularized, and there were two methods you could do from inside out cuts or outside in, and I did the outside in, called the Russian method. So basically, you're a little nervous because you're using that front blade and you're bringing it close to the visual axis. So we would do incisions which are 3, 4, 6, 12, or in some cases, or some people would do 4, 8, and 16 incisions. But basically what we were doing is, how much optical zone you had there, and sometimes it was down to a 2.5 optical zone, 16 incisions. And then sometimes you re-deepen the incisions out in the periphery. It wasn't really discovered or noticed or popularized until later on that these people would have a progressive hyperopia. Some of that was just missed because they were younger patients, meaning that you operate on a 20-year-old and they're plus 150. Who knows? They're 20/20, and you didn't make anything about it. You didn't look at it. So those issues came into play with time, and Fyodorov realized that. He saw that early on. And although he kept it to himself, he didn't say much because that was not the way he was. And he actually began working on phakic intraocular lens. And his idea, the thing that was supposed to supplant RK, was actually ICL. A lot of people don't know that. But remember, it wasn't until 1995 that we had PRK, and then 1999, 2000 when we had LASIK. So what happened was, he said, and I went over there and with the first scientific group after perestroika, the wall went down, and the Iron Curtain went down, and Fyodorov, the country was called the Wild Wild East because nobody understood capitalism. The only people that understood capitalism were people like Fyodorov, the oligarchs who were selling worldwide goods, right? Who are now that they call them the oligarchs, the billionaires over there, and the mob and the mafia and basically the criminals. So that was kind of the way that things were run over there. And I went over there with a group, and we went there, and they had the huge screens, and they had some hyperopic IOLs at the time, and we could certainly see. And these were slides back in those days. They had the slides, and we could certainly see 8 incisions, and they were slipping in this hyperopic ICL. And we said, "Oh, this is great!" So you can do your overcorrected RKs. You can correct that with a hyperopic ICL. the Russians talked a little bit together, and they leaned in and said, "We have no overcorrected. We have our case. We have no overcorrected our case." He said, "Okay." But I became friends with him, and he admitted. He said, "Chuck," he said, "this hyperopia problem is a problem." He said, "So what I did, not with the 3 and 4 incisions, you can do okay, the lower myopia. But once it gets 250 or 3 and above, and you're going to 8 incisions or 16 incisions, there's an issue with that. So we're going to create a phakic lens." That was supposed to take over, which LASIK wasn't there yet. Unfortunately, and the first lens he had was a collar button lens. He had the haptics basically in the sulcus and the optic basically above the iris. That didn't work out. There were too many problems with some inflammation and, some pigment loss and things like that. So his ICLs he understood that the long ICLs were a problem. So a lot of them were sharp, and I saw him windshield wipered over to the side because they were using the short. He had some problems with the material. But when we were talking, that's what his thoughts were. He then LASIK suddenly came into being, and people no longer, they said, "Oh, we don't have to put in these lenses." No. And now, instead of people 3 diopters and above, which is Star would love to put in that thing, and we only do that if people can't have LASIK. It's like, oh, now people can do LASIK or PRK first, and then it was LASIK, and that kicked ICLs up to the rare range to usually -7 and above, or people that can't have the laser. So that's the way that went. It was intended, and he was a great horseman. He loved women and horses in that order. And I would go over there, and I was one of the first in the world to do topical anesthesia. The first in the world to combine topical anesthesia with clear cornea incisions. Topical anesthesia had been around with Silkane since the 1890s. Clear corneal incisions had been around since 1747 with Daviel and Frenchman. So basically, but the procedure as it's done today, meaning the architecture of the wound, the 3-step procedure, all of that, I had in a course in 1992, a live course that I gave where I brought in 40 surgeons from all over the world in my center because I said, these are surgeons that need to see it, that kind of kick-started, that basically, and with clear cornea and topical anesthesia. So I had the old videotapes, and I had them converted to PAL and dubbed in Russian, and I brought it over there. And, became friends with him and spent some time in Russia. And, it was like, gave him a pair of cowboy boots, the Western, and gave him the belt. He had different shoe sizes because most people didn't know he had lost one leg when he was young. It killed his dreams of becoming a fighter pilot. He wanted to be a real pilot. So he went to ophthalmology, but, he was lauded all over the world for his basically not only RK, but ICLs, of course, his lens implants and things like that. And he was a great guy. Unfortunately, he went into politics, and I told him not to. He died in a helicopter crash in 1999, fairly young. He wasn't even my age when he died. I think he was about 70. And he was running for president. And I actually wrote him a note because I was corresponding with him off and on. And I said, you need to watch out, da-da-da-da-da. But he died in this helicopter crash that was on their way. And his widow got a nice condolences letter from a guy named Putin. So, now I think it's kind of clear how that happened and what went on. So that's kind of, with Slava, also I knew Barraquer very well. I spent some time. We had a Barraquer Steinway machine at my residency. Barraquer, back in the 40s, came from the famous family in Spain, went to Bogota, and in late 1940s, he wrote, the change in corneal curvatures and the law of corneal thickness for hyperopes and myopes and how to change that. And he named the procedure refractive surgery at that time. He never really he was unbelievably generous with his time, very brilliant guy. we had things where you take the disc off and freeze it and spin it, do that sort of thing and sew it on. And the forerunner, keratomalusis, was, of course, forerunner of LASIK, laser, keratomalusis, in situ keratomalusis, basically. So LASIK was kind of those terms and became a worldwide term, which, now is kind of to sort of negative because everybody thinks everything's LASIK. So, nowadays, if you say to somebody, just a stranger in the park, you say, well, I'm an eye surgeon. They're going to ask you if you do retinal detachments. They're going to say, well, you must do laser. You must do LASIK. Huh? So that's the key. You become a public-facing thing because you branded that name. Unfortunately, everything's branded with that, So that's kind of like my. He became a professor of ophthalmology at the Eye Foundation Hospital in the 70s, a little earlier than I got there. But he would come back and do professoralships, and he only had about 40 consults or converts, I think, throughout the world that were actively doing these procedures with the machine, I think, that were really committed, and we happened to be one of them. So I got to be there in surgery and see that and be kind of part of that, It was really great because some of these guys, the older guys, they had issues. A lot of these early procedures, like you said, you look at Fyodorov and you look at the failures and you look at RK and the failures and you look at everything. Unfortunately, it's not cancer culture. I never had this cancer culture idea in my mind. I learned that brilliant men, no matter who they are, that have significant great characteristics, can also have some significant faults and significant problems. But I never judged them by that. I would always, as I was always looking for knowledge, I would always take what was good, leave what was bad, and then walk away with it. And that was the way the early meetings in ophthalmology were before the KOL times. The KOL times now are programmed. It's a programmed thing. It's kind of like the ministry of truth. The whole group is either told what they already know or what you want them to know. And that's it. There is no, you learn the edgy things, the things that are on the edge, the moving things. You learn that in the hallways. Or some of these smaller meetings have that. But it's unfortunately, when I said the tragedy and the triumph of the KOL, it's kind of was and why that went about is because doctors would go up and say something, and then the companies would get sued, because the product shouldn't be used that way. So now, you're going to give a lecture, you know what you're going to give it on, what it's about. Your slides are probably approved, or they look at them, or sometimes they'll say, some of these people say, I will just send you the lecture slides and do that. So, you look up there, and for us who are, kind of at that point, we listen and we clap politely with where they are. But, it's kind of funny that basically we've ended up in this neuroadaptation stage because that's the stage we're in, right? That's all we're in. If you're a current practicing ophthalmologist and you're doing the best, you're all in the neuroadaptation. And a lot of people didn't really understand. They act like that's a new thing. Well, that's been around several million years. Neuroadaptation, right? Do you hallucinate?
Do I hallucinate?
Yeah.
No.
Do you dream?
I dream.
That's a hallucination. It's not real. So in your dream, do you dream in color ever?
I think so. At least I perceive it that way.
So how do you see color and images in your mind when you're completely asleep with your eyes closed? How is that produced? So when people talk about neuroadaptation, you already know that you're blinking as you're talking to me, and you're blinking, you go, well, why isn't this like staccato off and on, like the lights are turning off and on? And it's because images, the eye was, as it developed over millions of years, basically had the ability to adapt, to change for the better, to improve images, to be an image enhancer. And you said, well, why? And it's because all lenses, even biological lenses that you have in your eye, they're not perfect. So everybody's lenses aren't perfect. So eyes had to have the ability, to basically learn a way to adapt. And we know physiologically that occurs. We know where it occurs. We know that fusion occurs at the sixth ganglion, the geniculate ganglion. And we know that, the referral areas. And basically, we know that, goes back to, the V1 areas and then and then basically you have a referral to the frontal lobe, so that you basically learn to images, improve the images. So it's like these satellite images you always see on the spy movies where they got this grainy image and then the computer keeps moving the image, just like artificial intelligence or things like that. So your brain has the ability to improve these images that aren't necessarily perfect. So do the retinal cells to some degree. As I said, retinal ganglion cells have the ability basically to improve the sharpness of edges themselves, to improve image. So what happens is you learn to improve images, and you say, well, yeah, I learned that if I had a patient and they were amblyopic and didn't even use the eye, and their images wasn't even getting back to the brain, that I could patch the eye, and that the whole brain could come back. And you said, so you dream, you do this, you blink. And so it wouldn't come as a big surprise to everybody that if you put in different images to the eye, that they're not going to have either multifocal images, what we call simultaneous vision, or extended range of focus and a different multifocal in the other eye, that they would have the ability to do that. Or you put mini mono, pretty much up to minus 0.75. At some point, you're going to sacrifice basically, contrast, and then you're talking to the patient to kind of realize how much you're going to sacrifice and what it is, and trying to basically mix and match the eyes with the patient with what they do and with what they're expected to do. And so now we're in that range, like it's just a new thing that we've learned, and it's like, well, that's been around for a few million years, but I'm glad that everybody learns it. And that's why in every implant that comes out, the new implant, they'll talk about the visual acuity at the 1 day and the 1 week or 2 weeks. But when they talk about glare and halos, if you look at that, it's always at the 6-month period. And not only is it the 6-month period, but you look at the survey and see if it was a directed survey or they actually, admitted it. Like if you talk to them, you have any problems, they go, no, I'm doing fine. But if you said, do you ever have any glare and halos? Well, as a matter of fact, I guess I do, So, I mean, it's always kind of moved around a little bit to what I call is like an FDA study. We never do an FDA study to figure out the answer. We're not plotting the points and draw the line. If you're doing an FDA study, you're drawing the line and you're plotting the points. The study's designed to plot the points. It's too much money. You got to have the professionals do it. The amateurs can't do that. And like, oh, well, I'm sorry, we spent 5 years and $10 million and it's not working. So the reality is that what people kind of nowadays look on things, and I'm kind of laugh about it, and I kind of go, well, of course. People neuroadapt, and some people are better at neuroadapting than others. And obviously you have to hit certain points. You have to explain to people, but you have to put them back like, you know what, you're going to see best out in a year. Kind of like a knee replacement that I've had. They don't, walk and you're going to get better, but don't expect to get really better until about a year or something like that. But you'll do really well. So, so people have this great expectation, if you overdo it, then they're going to be upset. And you got to figure out the frontal lobe is part of it. You got to figure out if they're the personality that can take that. I've sold many a patient. Yeah, this could work. You could do this and it'd be fine, but you're not psychologically suited for it. I just told them I'm unwilling to. And I just look at them, and not mean. I just go, I can't take your case. And it upsets them. They're going, oh, my God, what do you mean? I go, yeah, this is why. I said, you're welcome. You can go to somebody else. They're willing to do it, but I'm not willing to do it because I don't think you're at a point that you could do that. And, so sometimes you have to be honest with people, not in a mean way, but in a way that's going to protect them and protect yourself.
Yep. Yeah, I turn away probably 10 to 15% of patients across the board, whether it's cataract surgery, refractive surgery.
Yeah, they hear about all the stories and everything. They're going to be perfect, and it's all this thing, and it's not. It's real surgery, And the reason we don't have a lot of refractive surgeons, it's hard work. It's a lot of work. It's a lot to deal with. It's a lot of responsibility. The reality is most of the people in our specialty don't want that responsibility. They don't want to take it on. They may not want you to do it, but they certainly don't want to do it. And that's the problem when we get into nowadays with refractive surgery on the decline. Why is it? There's 330 million people. They don't come to you or to me or to the guys we know who are our friends that do all this and have great results and great thing. They go to local health care and they're not given the services. So we have to, what we're fighting is not other refractive surgeons. It's basically the fear and misunderstanding of refractive surgery itself.
Let's go back to refractive surgery. You mentioned your time with Fyodorov, Barraquer. Talk about your friendship and working relationship with Roberto down in Mendoza.
Yeah, Roberto and I are such good friends because we were there at the early days of ICL. And the problem that we had when we were the first scientific group that went over there, a number of people, Monis Kraft, a number of people at the time, well, some of them not with us anymore, Gail Martin, people like that we were going to take this technology and we had to improve it. So Star bought the technology, and it was great because Star was a very progressive, had done the foldable lens, and the fact that I popularized the ICL that basically could clear corneal incisions, which at the time, the parameters, everything to do, diamond knives, sitting temporally, that whole deal. The incision, once again, I was lucky. I did an incision with a groove and put it in, not because later on it was proven that it was a more stable incision that way. This triplanar incision that people say. It was because that the injectors were so big and hard to put in that if you just went straight in, that little thin piece of cornea you're trying to grab onto it, you'd bite some off. So I wanted a thicker piece of cornea, so I did a groove. So I did this, and then we went in and dimpled down. So sometimes it was just luck when I did that, because some of these people that were doing it early, like, oh my God, we got an endophthalmitis, we got an increase in endophthalmitis, we got this. I never had that. I was always temporal. I was always using diamond knives from my archaic experience. I knew that where I needed to stay away from, and the diamond knives were the better, and I was creating trapezoidal incisions and that sort of thing. Roberto came in when we were looking for ways to improve the vaults. And there were about six basically iterations of that he had to work through, and he did that down in Mendoza. He did that work, and I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's just a beautiful.
I was there in November. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess he still has the mansion there, and that beautiful place, and you just see this, and it looks like this mansion there, and the gates and everything. And I was with the first group. He had the first group that he was officially bringing over there, and we have the picture kind of hanging, and I'm there in that first group that went there when we got to a point that we started giving courses in this. And so I saw this guy running around who was Roger, this kid, running around. So yeah, he's going to be an ophthalmologist one day, So we always laugh. We take pictures together, me and Blake, and he and Roger is kind of like, here we are, the old guys and the young guys. So Roberto was basically the master in that, and basically we owe a lot of big debt to him to be able to do that, because a lot of people. I was on the ICL study when it came to the United States. The hyperopic ICL study got thrown out. But the ICL study that was there. The problem with the early ICL studies was that the FDA came in and they said, listen, we'll do this, and you can only do it in people under the age of 45, because and the thing that we don't want to see is we don't want to see cataracts. If y'all cause a cataract, we're done. This technology won't go, which led to the thing of, well, we got to have as big a vault as we can because we want to stay as far away from that lens. So that led the company to put out its recommendations of lens lengths, which weren't good. And everybody that did them really said, okay, we're not doing that. We're going to do this length. We did a lesser length. And so we knew that early on before the early date, before Evo came in and before all of that came in finally after the years. But so he and I just have stayed in touch. And since I was an early adopter of ICLs and also was working with Star, and Star was the early thing that would clear cornea for me because they had the foldable lens. The foldable lens put all the hard lens people out of business, put all the Ethicon suture people out of business. And so, maybe I wasn't on their Christmas list, to do that. And so Roberto was instrumental in that, and we were kind of champions of that. And so we became extremely good friends over the years. And I was sitting with him the other day on the front thing watching both our kids talking up on the podium, and that thing. So I said, yeah, here we are sitting here and we're watching these guys. So it's good. It's kind of come full circle for us. And, we still are there, and he's still working, and I'm still working a little bit. But we both have a bunch of kids and grandkids. Well, kids are kind of older, but grandkids. So we've had a good respect and through all these years, and still are close friends.
So RK ICL's development in the United States, what led to surface ablation or PRK kind of coming to the forefront and then eventually evolving into LASIK?
Well, we had one of the first LASIK lasers. The first lasers weren't the ones that are out now, PRK came in, and basically you were, it was a lot simpler because you were basically just taking off the surface, and then you were going to basically do the correction, and that was it. But the problem with PRK came in was basically the how much laser you had to do, and the higher myopes, that was a problem. There was also issues with the possibility that one of the things that you couldn't do, and we had people that I did a PRK on my nurse, and there was some corneal scarring in the visual axis, and so that you had some untoward results with that. Really, Ionis Policaris, basically Creek, was one of the first guys that kind of started the idea of let's do a corneal flap. Let's take a corneal flap off. And then basically, at first, they were just taking the whole flap off and then putting it back on, doing the laser, put it back on. But then they said, well, let's do the corneal flap. Let's get underneath that and lift the flap. And that basically also eliminated this long wait period for people to actually see or get their best vision. It's more instantaneous vision, and obviously people had a lot less irritation, a lot less problems. So that's when LASIK took off. But in those days, we were using the early keratomes. There were a lot of problems with those keratomes. Some of the people, you had to put blocks in them or doing this. Some people did it, go right into the cornea, into the anterior chamber. And so there were issues with those keratomes. We didn't have all the testing to know what the people were keratoconus or pre-keratoconus or anything like that. So all of that first 10 years from 1999 to about 2009, over those years, it built up all the complications that nobody ever heard of. And you say, why didn't they hear? Because we, as doctors, were in charge, meaning that you didn't see that on TV. You didn't see that you only saw that, only certain doctors at certain positions got asked to report, just like if you're the Encyclopedia Britannica, that was the knowledge, and whatever it is. There wasn't an internet that everything's out there. And just like the internet is a giant dumpster, you dumpster diving, you get misinformation, information. And we were in control. And when everything crashed, it all happened at the same time. In 2009, 2008, there was an economic downturn in the world. In the United States, it started in the United States basically with subprime lending, meaning people were getting this rates, and banks were giving just people that didn't have the money to basically pay or stand behind these loans, had 4 or 5 condos and things like that. And these banks that gave them that started to go out of business. the big houses on Wall Street that had these banks were starting to go out of business, too big to fail, and these types of things. So the economy crashed. At the same time, the FDA, there was all these building up of obviously the reports. The FDA came out with a bad report that 50% of people that were having LASIK were having complications, dry eye or some sort of thing. And there was basically this bad report by LASIK, and that would have been not so bad, but also something. The thing that was basically the trifecta was there was something called the handheld cell phone that became the handheld computer, and at the same time, all of a sudden, you had basically social media. So for 5,000 years, doctors had been the only people that you would hear from, and you only hear from the expert doctors what you wanted to say or what was you wanted them to know. Now you could be, somebody in, a nut in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly become the expert at something, and you could deliver 5 million followers. So no longer were we in charge of the medical narrative. Things dropped down in half, and it will remain that way. So what we learned from that is not a lot. We haven't learned anything. It's still there, and it was a black swan event, which is characterized, by Talib Nassim. Basically, he says it's an unexpected, something that's unexpected that you wouldn't do, that has terrible impact. And what you do, it's natural for humans to try to concoct an answer so it won't happen again. So all the answers we concocted, like, well, it was the economy. Economy came back. No. Well, it's rebranding. Oh, let's rebrand this. Let's call it another name. No. Let's forget about LASIK. Let's do, clear, or let's do smile. No. That was just basically cannibalizing one procedure for another. And so it's remained the same, and now it's continued to go down. It turns out that when you lose the public's trust and patients' trust, it takes a lot more to get it back than you think. And that's where we are. Most of the doctors and all of the companies have refused to do what it takes to get it back. And, I've kind of had a talking to them because I said, this is, I think, one of the biggest threats to us all is our total addressable market isn't growing. The population's growing. Myopes are growing. That's not growing. That's fact. That's declining. So what's happening is you're putting people, your practice, everybody's practice, including the different companies who, buy my laser, do this procedure, in competition. Well, you'd say, why are we in competition when it's only 0.2% penetration? We're in competition because we don't have a lot of refractive surgeons, basically, and they've found no way to grow this total addressable market. They're not concentrating on that. And I've seen them year after year get up on podiums, and I've explained it to them, and they go, no. That seems like it's really hard to do. And I found ways to do it. We have found ways to do it in our practice, at least, that I've kind of espoused. But you can only do that by getting patients in front of you. It's a doctor-patient relationship. You have to get back. You can't advertise it. You can't say it in a jingle. You can't say, I do a smile, and it's just you have to find ways to get the patient in front of you, and then only then can you really explain to the patient what it is. And we found that we could increase our numbers by doing that. We found inventive ways to do that.
Oh, I know you have to get to LAX, so I want to be respectful of your time. We still have a little time, but what time is the car coming to get you? Is it 2 or 2:30?
Let's see. It's between 2 and 2:30 right in there.
Perfect. Because there's a lot I want to get into. So tell me about the history of the Refractive Surgery Alliance and what led to that. What led to the need initially to form that organization? We'll get into the World College later, but maybe let's start with that.
Yeah, Refractive Surgery Alliance was created by a guy named Guy Kazarian. I had known Guy Kazarian as a doctor in Mississippi at the time, way back when. He actually worked for a doctor who graduated from my residency in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. So back in the RK days, this older doctor, this guy was a little bit older than I was, he employed Guy Kazarian to be his RK guy. So RK came on board. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to get into that. And so he brought this guy in. And I kind of knew him from that. He contracted basically an arthritic condition. I didn't know him well. He had this arthritic condition that allowed him no longer to operate. And it was at that time. So he hasn't done surgery as far as I know for 35, 40 years. He took some business school courses and decided that he would go into the business of ophthalmology. He went into the business of ophthalmology, and he was looking for. He was trying to be part of ACOS. They spent a little bit of time with him, and they became at odds. The people he at ACOS came at odds, so they kind of like, we're going to know. ACOS has a close contact with industry and people like that. So early on, some of the people that own ACOS, who you know well, basically said, no, you can't be one of the early guys here. We don't want you in this. So he got upset about that, and then he had some other business deals called Strathspey Crown, some other things that he went into, trying to get groups of ophthalmologists. He himself personally wasn't somebody that could sell lenses to. He didn't do it. So he's trying to get people together in these business deals. Some of these business deals didn't work out entirely. So basically, he created his own group that he owned entirely, called Refractive Surgery Alliance. And the idea behind that was, this is just for refractive surgery. That's all it is. We're going to create this alliance of people, and we're going to promote refractive surgery itself. And the kicker in that was going to be this sort of like basically ethical type of thing was saying, and we take no money from industry. We don't want any money, which is different from a lot of the other meetings where the only way they stay alive is by industry. Okay. So the idea was that was going to do, he kind of created it out of his own house and that. One of the best things that came out of that was that he had a forum. And
that's how I found you.
Yeah. And my son Blake was, on the RSA and some other young people. And, I knew a little bit about it, but there was not anything there in particular, I saw like, there's nothing there that's going to help my practice, that sort of thing. So I didn't do it. And Blake kind of got me involved in that, where he said, listen, this is forum and people are asking a lot of questions. You have a lot of experience. And with Blake, over the years, he's asked fewer and fewer questions because he got more and more experience. But when he was first asking, he'd say, oh, Dad, come see this. I'd walk in a room and he'd say, oh, God, I've never seen something like that. I don't know what it is. And then I'd look at something in about 10 seconds. I'd say, it's this and this and this is what you need to do. And he'd go, what? You need to look at it again. I said, no, I've seen this. So the reality is, sometimes when you have a lot of experience, it's a lot of things that you'll never forget, even if you've seen one or two. So the reality of that situation is that I was able to kind of do that and add some of my advice that I would do. And not so much, just on the, here's what you need to do medically or this or that, but what you need to do ethically, practice-wise, how that relates to the rest of the world. What I did was put some of my studies in the humanities, because I studied everything. You mentioned, by the way, that I had a degree in creative writing and art. I didn't have a degree. I never got a degree in college. I never got a degree in high school. They gave me one, because then I went to college and I went out to, and then when I went to college, I didn't have a degree because I studied everything. I studied, religion. I studied everything. The humanities was something that was very important to me, and I read a lot. And I got through. If you said, well, how did you get through with all this? And I got through because I was never an organized guy. I envied people that was organized. I had notes and everything. I had like one notebook for college and one for medical school. But I could remember, my older brother and I learned to read when we were 2 or 3. my Aunt Weta ran the library in Pleasant Hill in the middle of nowhere. And, you're in the middle of nowhere, you're not doing anything, so you learn to read. And we got astronomy, we got Sky and Telescope, which is still out from the 40s. And, it wasn't the centerfold was actually the night sky for the thing. And we had a 4-inch reflector telescope. And so we had chemistry sets, and being Scotch Irish, we made bombs, things like that. So the reality is that we had this intellectual curiosity, but my older brother, so I've been with 40 years, has read 3 books a week in between patients for 40 years. So so we read everything, and we would read everything. And I could remember, that's how I got through school, is I remember when I saw something, I remembered it. And so the humanities were a way that basically you could add several things that would sometimes be relevant and resonate with their specialty by trying to add in history or poetry or something. I would talk about different things, and Prometheus bound, and Prometheus basically stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind to better mankind. And of course, we saw what they did to Prometheus. He has liver eaten out and grow back, or he get eaten out every day. So basically, sometimes you learn the lesson of, sometimes these good deeds or these great deeds sometimes are punished, and no good deed goes unpunished. So basically, I would put some of that in, and my goal in that was to try to add the humanities aspect to what we're doing, rather than just the cold, like, oh, do this and do this and do this. It was trying to add in a way of looking at things. I didn't want to teach people what to think as much more as how to think. That's the most important thing for me. My thing was like, how do you approach this? How do you think? And what way you should do this and prepare yourself. Integrity is not a 90% or 95% thing. You either have it or you don't. There's certain things that I would teach people or try to teach them. If you're, people would ask me if I'm going to start, where do I start? I'd go at the top. I go, what? At the top. I said, you do everything. You start at the top. The top, it's very lonely. You go to the top and you find out, oh my God, I thought this, when I got here, like everybody was going to be doing everything. And it's like, no, there's only X number of us. And you know who they are. You all know who they are. They're all your friends, right? And you know who they are. And I said the middle is a breeding ground for mediocrity. And a lot of our ophthalmologist colleagues are in the middle ground. They don't want to come up. It's a different world up there. You're having to do a lot of things, and you have a lot of expectations, and you have a lot more responsibility. And you have to carry that in a certain way in order to be able to do what you do and make your patients happy and make your staff happy. And because you're different from everybody else who just says, oh, insurance pays for that. These people are paying for it. And, they're kind of have an expectation. So those sorts of things I was kind of putting in, because there's a tendency in our specialty to, for these different mills to do these cataract mills and LASIK mills and things like that. I never press advertised, never did it. I never would do it. I still will never do it. There's just certain things that you have to kind of say to yourself you're never going to do, and cross the things you want to cross. It's like this is what you do. But it also was a way to find. You say, why did you graduate in what you graduated in? Well, my older brother graduated in European history. My third brother, who never made a B in his life, graduated in general studies. And my fourth brother, who's a PA, and he wanted to go into it. And the reason he's a PA is he wanted to become a professor in American history. And then he finally realized that, I can't make a living kind of doing this. And he went back to school, and he decided the shortcut was to be PA. And he's worked for us now. He's 57 years old. He's worked for us for years. So the reality of that is that you go to undergraduate school to be educated. When you got into medical school, you go to be trained. And if you tell me you're the best guitar player in Los Angeles, then I'd say, well, you're not a doctor because you're spending all your time playing the guitar until your fingers bled, or you're spending all your time practicing medicine and doing this. So the reality of that is there's so much time you have to do. And so in the RSA, I tried to contribute that, which might have been a little different. I didn't know really how it was going to be taken by people, but I found out a lot of young people kind of appreciated it, and I said, well, I'll keep doing that. And that's why I was there, and that's why that was kind of my contribution. And I was a big proponent of refractive surgery, and my deal was always to try to help people. So my door was always open to do whatever it was, to what advice I could give. I didn't put myself above anybody or this or that. People always knew I can call Chuck. I can pick up the phone, I can call him, he'll answer a question, or he'll give his best answer, his best shot at it, And, I tried to stay away from, some people would say stuff that wasn't exactly right. And, I try to be kind of nice and say, there's a certain way of trying to give people another way of doing it without having pick fights on these things. And you got to kind of watch out for that sometimes. But, I think that that was one of the things that I learned when the WCRS came on. One of the first things I wanted to do was create the forum, which is good. It basically helps a lot of people.
Talk to me about why refractive surgery as a subspecialty, and then, maybe the desire of the college to recognize it as its own independent specialty is so different from other subspecialties within ophthalmology.
Well, it's actually a specialty. The definitions of a subspecialty and a subspecialty are completely different. A subspecialty is something that's just basically some minor change in your normal, your normal everyday practice. You just make this minor change and, you're doing this or this or this. A specialty deals with an entirely different audience, basically. So, it's directed in an entirely different direction. So when we became refractive surgeons, suddenly we were no longer treating a disease. We're no longer treating glaucoma, retinal detachment, that sort of thing. Basically tropias and whatever. We weren't treating these things. We were actually looking at function. We were looking at visual function. And that's a completely different type of basically target that you're looking at. The audience is a cash-paying audience. It's a different type of patient base. So it's kind of really a specialty on its own to some degree. Now you have to go through ophthalmology to get through there. In some of the specialties, like if you look at, people may say, oh, well, what about, plastic surgery? Well, plastic surgery separated from general surgery 90 years ago. 90 years ago. It was really more basically at that time dealing with injuries and things like that, and then, and the 60s and the 70s came and suddenly breast implants came in, facelifts, and, basically rhinoplasties and, hair transplants and, on and on and on, right? So, it changed to more cosmetic aspect, basically purely cosmetics after that time. And so, when we talked about refractive surgery, we were talking about a different zone that we're in, different expectations, a cash pay, completely different than the insurance-based model that basically did disease. A lot of doctors are more comfortable with that, and they stay in that zone. We're in a different deal, and as we say, we improve as fast as technology improves. So we're constantly having to change is basically the constant for us. And a lot of doctors don't like change. They don't like changing things different. Machines are expensive. A lot of these things are hard. You're constantly having to keep up with everything. And so that doesn't sit well with a certain amount of ophthalmologists, which is fine. So we wanted to be a specialty on its own. Unfortunately, out of the 24 medical boards since 1933, the American Board of Medical Specialties, the last board that was produced was in 1991, 34 years ago. Now, under those boards, there are 150 specialties and subspecialties. Ophthalmology recognizes none. And there's a specific reason for that. These are private boards. The American Board of Ophthalmology is a private deal. The guy who runs that gets $1 million a year, a little over $1 million from all these tests, and people have to re-up every few years and do that. And he has about 5 or 6 employees, and you can see their things. It's a big business for them. They certainly weren't going to dilute that if retina was going to have their own deal. So if you think if anybody ought to be different, the retina guys ought to be different. So retina tried to lobby them for years to be able to be recognized by the American Board of Ophthalmology. Never did. And you said, why is that exactly? Like, give me the exact reason for that. Because the American Board of Ophthalmology basically is at odds with the Association of University Professors of Ophthalmology, the AUPO. The AUPO basically has their own, if you look, refractive surgery isn't an academic, you don't have refractive surgery in academic institutions, but you do have retina, you do have cornea, you do have these things. Well, the AUPO said, we want to set our own guidelines. If we're training these people, we want to set the guidelines that we want. The American Board of Ophthalmology says, no. I want the guidelines set by the American the Council of Graduate Medical Education, who oversees colleges and stuff like that. And I want them to do that. Well, of course, these guys don't even require refractive surgery to be in residency. So they were completely at odds. So as a result, they've tried to negotiate for years. I have an article from 2010, and finally they just gave up. So every specialty, if you look at, they had to create their own group because they said, well, are we just going to allow anybody to be a retinal specialist? What are we going to do? And they said, no, we got to have the fellowship. So they created their groups and they have their own fellowship. Cornea did. They have Neuroop, cornea, they have all these things. So everybody, if I was in a room with 600 doctors and I was giving a talk to retinal specialists, 600 of them would be fellowship trained. If I'm in a room with 600 ophthalmologists, maybe 15% of them would be fellowship trained. 20% of them, maybe at the most. There's not a lot of private fellowships, and they're not in public institutions. And the reason they are is that the American Council of Graduate Medical Education will not allow those quote unquote fellows to be deemed as junior staff. They say, oh no, you're just like another year of residency. So we will not pay you. If you do a procedure on your own, we're not going to pay the money. So the reality is it came down to control and money. The reason that ophthalmology started as a specialty in the first place was control and money. So, that's what it comes down to in a lot of the world, and that's where we are today. And that's why the World College of Refractive Surgery and Visual Sciences was created primarily to promote and establish refractive surgery. 40 years behind retina, we're the last specialty to do it, and we have to create certain criterion. Can people just go to a couple of refractive surgery days and say, I'm a refractive surgeon and I'm as good as Arjan Hura, and have all these? You have to have some qualifications. It's important. Qualifications is the first thing of anybody that is a professional of any kind. Somebody that's an accountant or a lawyer. So the reality of that is we said, well, we have to have threshold requirements. And these are threshold. I don't like to call them minimal, but, you'd be surprised how little amount of surgery you have to do to be a qualified plastic surgeon. So, but we created some significant ones, and we said, look, there's some core guys, and they got to be out a few years, and they have to do this. And we're also creating this in the fellowship idea. People that get out of a fellowship, they're mentored, Mentorship is very important. It's a very powerful thing. And mentorship, you know what the difference between learning something and being mentored in something is? When you learn something, you think about it. You have to think. If you're mentored, just like if you're an athlete and you're trained and trained and trained, if you're mentored, the idea is you're doing things without thinking. So when you're doing surgery and you're doing stuff literally without thinking about it. I mean, you're just reacting to it. It's not like you're sitting there like you're academically thinking about each step. So mentorship is important, having somebody there that reinforces you and does that and pushes you until it becomes so ingrained in you that you just have that as kind of, this is part of what I have. This is part of my bag. And, and you're constantly trying to add on to the edges of that knowledge, basically, to expand that. And we knew that, okay, that's good. If you have a fellowship for a year, fewer numbers because you're only there a year, but you had this mentorship by this guy that we know, and we accredit there's accreditation and certification. You can only certify human beings. Living things get certified. Accreditation is programs, institutions, things like that, equipment. That's certification. That's accreditation. So they're different things. So that's the goal, and we wanted to promote refractive surgery. We don't want to be in the business of giving meetings. If we gave meetings, then all of our people that would sign up as fellows or try to basically apply for fellowship, a lot of those are trying to make money running these meetings, and it's like, we didn't need to go run the meetings, and other people wanted to, oh no, we want to run meetings and we want to compete with all of these things. We want to be the umbrella organization, which I think will eventually be, that all organizations say, hey, we have to have some sort of credentialing body. These people will be a credentialing body, and they're going to give academic credentials by our own volition, meaning that our own authority. And you go, yeah, whose authority? Well, name another authority. No, there's no other one. So we're going to do it by our own authority, just like the retina guys did. And eventually maybe everybody be fellowship trained. That's nice. But the reality of that situation is that you need that. You need qualifications to really say that you're a professional at what you're doing. And to separate yourself, important when you get out there is, yeah, I do all these things, but this is what I have. This is my qualification. So those are important things to us, and that's what we're doing. And we think that eventually, because first they realize, oh, who are these guys? Are they competing against us? The only people that may not deal with us are the people, once again, looking like influence. What kind of influence will this have? What kind of influence will Dr. Williamson have? What kind of influence will he have on these manufacturers? We want the power. We want to have the power and the influence. The problem is we're so far down the road from them. They never want that, and they are so diverse. AAO and the ASRS. People like ACOS and C and some of the other smaller meetings, they're all for it. They're kind of thinking now like, maybe we should have a strategic alliance of all of us guys because we're all trying to do the same thing, different names. Maybe this is like the NFL, and this group is the Kansas City Chiefs, and this group is the New York Jets, and this what's wrong with that? What's wrong with everybody having their own group, their own fellowships, their own meetings, and having their own brand, but yet working together towards standardization and a certain group? And that's what we're there to be. But that's a lot of hard work. And we're like, yeah, but we'll be the umbrella. We'll do that for you, because you really have to have a third body doing that. You can't do the same thing. You have to have somebody else doing it for you. So we're a third body. So, the ACOS people, we could do it for everybody. And we've actually been starting to be asked by people now that run those, that suddenly see that as there were some changes in leadership. Once those changes occurred, people are like, okay, now we want to talk to you, because people had we had to get rid of some changes in leadership before we did that.
So if you were coming out of residency, let's say there's a resident listening to this conversation and they're like, gosh, well, refractive surgery sounds great. How do I get into it? What would you recommend for someone coming out today?
Well, the first thing I would say is that, I think that ideally, if you could do a fellowship, is find a fellowship, okay? And the reason for that is you're at a stage that you're young, you're just out, you're not moved. Something, you can basically give that time, right? But, if you're out on your own, trying to create a business, trying to do that, trying to work, have hours, have a house, trying to basically decide, I want to move here the rest of my life, decide where you're going to be, you may never be able to get back to that ever again. And it's your one chance to do it at that time. And it's, it fits nicely into basically being able to go into that. So we're trying to create the World Council of Refractive Surgery Fellowships. We're trying to get all the private fellowships together and actually start having matching programs to create more fellowships to do that. But that would be the first thing that I would say is that basically if you do a mentored fellowship, that goes a long way because you learn a lot of things that you never knew. How practice is run. How do you collect money? What is that? What is accounts receivable? What kind of, a number of things. And we want to get these, we're actually putting these fellowships together in kind of a group, much like we're saying, so that people could say, oh, well, we don't do SMILE in my fellowship, but we do SMILE over here where we can do, we can bring training in, bring the companies in to be part of that. So the reality of that is I think that's part of the future that's going to be big, and we're hoping to push people towards that. Other than that, most of the people that are our fellows are obviously learned on the job. They learned on the job. That's why we put the 5-year deal out there for a core fellow, because you can't learn overnight. It takes you a while. And, we knew that somebody out 2 years, just trying to do it on their own, they don't necessarily have the knowledge to do that. So, and it's a lot harder for the young guys because you remember the way I learned, I said, Chuck, you had it easy, dude. You just, when stuff rolled off the wagon, you did a bolt-on procedure. Like, yep, bolt that one on, bolt this one on. Sure. So I learned like that. And where the learning curve was different over the years. You said, so you had like 40 years. Like, I got to get out and like do this right away. I got a lot of stuff to learn. And you didn't have to go through some of the things we went through. But then again, we weren't asked to be at that level right away. Now you're like, you got to get out and you got to be as good as the guy that's been out forever. So the reality is that you got to get out and you work very hard. You go to these meetings like this, you listen to podcasts, you try to pick up information wherever you can get it. You get your own group of friends, which I know you have. You're very good friends with my son, and you guys all know each other. And that's the one thing that I think that the social media and everything's done. You all kind of know each other. You ask each other questions, and you got ready answers. So you've got kind of people that have your back, and it's a lot of fun the way you guys can do it and get along because you're like one family of doing that, and that's the way to do it. You get in with these people and you learn from people, and you learn how to do things and how to do things right, and you work very hard at doing it. And one day with time. You become better and better. I always called itself, it's just, you would become a master surgeon. People would say, oh, we're going to have this course and we're going to have master surgeons teach this course. I always kind of laugh about what's a master surgeon? Exactly what is that? You can master a procedure. It may take you a while, okay? But to master yourself takes a lifetime. That's just the way it works. So a lot of people you can't have one without the other in our business. That's what you have to do. The best of the best, that's what they learn. They're constantly doing it. Even at my age, at 74 years of age, I continue to learn. I continue to stay in. I like what I do. I like challenges. But I learned the old way, and I learned pathophysiology. I learned the way everything works. And I try to add to that knowledge. I try to say, why does this happen? Why does that happen? Why does, explain to me the neuroadaptation. I had to study all that. I had to figure it out. I had to, and then just common sense things like I talked to you today is like, do you hallucinate? Well, no. Do you dream? Well, oh yeah, I do. How do you see that? So you got to really say, wow, the brain really has a tremendous plasticity. And I've been in dreams where, man, I was fighting this, but I had whole wars going on. I had all sorts of things going on. And it was like, well, if I could do that, surely I can negotiate a mini motto. I mean, so the reality is that you learn these things and you learn to appreciate them and look at them in a different way. And that's the key, I think, in these guys. You got to have a learning experience, and you're going to learn for life. And you got to start off just like a rookie. You get in there, you have respect to the elders, you pay your homage to people, and then and I tell people, I say, listen, it's like being in the tribe. The old tribe gets you in, and you have to do certain rituals, and you have certain things, and you have certain do things, and you work your way up to the tribe because you want to know the secret word. You're going to be given the secret word. So one day you finally get in with the elders and you say, okay, I'm ready. Yes, you've done everything. And you go, okay, what's the secret word? And we say, there is no secret word. It's just what I said. You act. Action basically gives you those things. It gives you courage. It gives you empathy. It gives you patience. It gives you understanding. And if you act that way, you will become that person. That's what you have to do.
Well, Chuck, this was fantastic. I've had a lot of good conversations this weekend at Ascris, but this has definitely been my favorite, and I'm so glad we're able to finally sit down and do this. 6 years ago, I'd reached out to you separately because I was heeding and your insight and reading your wisdom on the RSA forum, and you were sort of predicting the future of the next 10 to 15 years of refractive surgery. And I reached out to you as a resident, and I said, what should I be doing now? And I didn't know whether that email was going to get an answer. And you gave me back a very nice set of actions. And here we are 6 years later.
Yeah, I know. You guys are, I always say that I have to keep an eye on you guys. My mother told me, and my oldest son is 51 now, so he's off the hook. He said, son, you got to watch your kids until they're like at least 50. I said, 50, Mom? He said, yeah, well, 50, I'm figured, I must be old. You're at 50, so you're not 50, so I still try to keep an eye on you guys, but once you get past that thing, you're over the hill, and then it's kind of like we don't have to keep an eye on you anymore. So us old guys try to sit there and then and do what we can. We slow down, we get down, but it's very exciting to see you, and very exciting to see everybody up on the podium and kind of part of what we do, and that's kind of like that's where it all comes back around. It all comes back around to kind of saying, look at him, look at Arjan up there, man, he's up there. So that's fun. It's fun for us, So we get that's how we get our kicks now. So we still love to see the patients. I still love to talk to patients. I still love to do surgery. My hands and my mind is still there. I can't run like I used to. But we really enjoy seeing you take over in leadership and what you're doing. So I appreciate everything you're doing.
I appreciate your support. Thank you for your time, Chuck.
My pleasure.
This is great.